The desert winds howled as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sands of ancient Egypt in fiery streaks of crimson and gold. Shadows stretched long and dark across the dunes, and the air seemed to hum with something ancient, something alive. It was a time when gods walked the earth and the skies trembled beneath their battles. Bloodlines of kings were shaped by the victories of divine warriors, and chaos lurked like a serpent beneath the surface, waiting for its moment to strike. The gods of Egypt were not distant beings hidden in unreachable heavens. They were present, their voices carried on the winds, their anger rumbling in the storms, their mercy flowing in the life-giving waters of the Nile. Yet, even these gods, immortal and powerful, were not free from fear, jealousy, and rage. Their stories were written in conflict, carved into temple walls, and whispered by priests who feared what might happen if the balance between order and chaos shattered. There was Ra, the mighty sun god, whose golden bark sailed across the sky by day and plunged into the underworld by night. But darkness never let go willingly. Apophis, the serpent of destruction, waited in the shadows of the underworld, ready to devour the light and bring endless night. Night after night, Ra faced the serpent's gaping jaws, its scales glistening with venom, its hiss promising death. It was said that every dawn was a victory, a reminder that the gods had not yet fallen, but the battle was never truly won. And then there was Set, the red-skinned god of storms and deserts. His name was spoken with both fear and awe. He was chaos given form, a force that defied order and shattered harmony. He murdered Osiris, the gentle king of fertility and life, tearing his body apart and scattering it across the land. The sands ran red that day, and the heavens wept. But Set's crime did not end with death. It unleashed something far greater, a war that shook the divine and mortal worlds alike. Osiris' wife, Isis, was not a goddess to be silenced by grief. Her cries became storms, and her tears fed the Nile. She searched every corner of Egypt to find the broken pieces of her husband, piecing him back together with magic and love. Yet Osiris could no longer walk among the living. He became ruler of the underworld, a god of the dead, leaving his son, Horus, to face Set and reclaim what was stolen. Horus grew under the watchful eyes of his mother, his destiny carved into the stars. When the time came, his wings spread wide, and his falcon eyes burned with vengeance. The clash between Horus and Set was no ordinary battle. It was the rage of storms against the unyielding earth. It was fire against fire, thunder against thunder. Set roared, his spear tearing through the skies, while Horus struck back with a blade sharper than any mortal's. Their war raged across deserts, rivers, and even the heavens, shaking the pillars of existence. But their fight was not just for power. It was for balance, for the survival of order itself. For in the heart of Egyptian mythology, there was a constant struggle between Ma'at, the principle of truth and harmony, and Isfet, the force of chaos and destruction. These battles were more than stories. They were warnings, reminders that even the gods could bleed, that even immortals had to fight to preserve the fragile thread of existence. Some battles were swift and furious. Others stretched across ages, lingering in the whispers of priests and the chants of temple rituals. When Sekhmet, the lion-headed goddess of war, was sent to punish humanity for its sins, her fury was unstoppable. Blood filled the rivers, and screams echoed through villages. She was a force of destruction, unstoppable and wild, until Ra, horrified by her wrath, tricked her into drinking red-dyed beer, soothing her rage with illusions of blood. And then there was Batet, her twin in form but opposite in spirit. Where Sekhmet raged, Batet protected. Yet even she had her battles, guarding the pharaoh's lands from the serpents of chaos that crept in the night. It was said that every hiss in the darkness was a reminder that the gods never slept, never rested. These battles were not distant memories for the people of ancient Egypt. They were alive, present in every sunrise, every flood of the Nile, every crack of thunder. The pharaohs wore the crowns of Horus, carried the scepters of Osiris, and invoked the might of Ra as they led their armies into battle. They believed their victories were echoes of the divine wars, proof that Ma'at still held its ground against the chaos that threatened to consume it all. But the wars of the gods were not only fought in the skies or the sands. They raged in the hearts of men, and the choices between honor and betrayal, love and hatred, sacrifice and greed. The gods did not fight to destroy each other. They fought to remind the world that harmony must be earned, that order must be defended, and that chaos is never far away. The stories of these battles were carved into stone and painted on the walls of tombs. They were sung by priests and passed down by scribes who understood their weight. These tales were not just myths, they were prayers, shields against the darkness that pressed at the edges of existence. Even now, when the sands have swallowed their temples and time has buried their cities, the echoes of those battles linger. The hiss of Apophis still coils in the shadows, the roar of Set still rumbles in distant storms, and the falcon eyes of Horus still watch from the skies. The gods may no longer walk among us, but their battles never truly ended. The darkness stirred, coiling like a living thing beneath the earth. It slithered through the shadows, unseen but always felt, pressing against the edges of existence. The air in the underworld grew thick, heavy with the scent of fear and rot. And there, in the heart of the abyss, the serpent waited. Its scales shimmered like blackened gold, its eyes burning with hunger. It was Apophis, the enemy of light, the devourer of suns. Far above, Ra's golden bark floated across the sky, cutting through the heavens like a blade of fire. The world drank in his light, clinging to it as a lifeline. Fields of green rose from the earth because of him. The Nile shimmered in his reflection, and the sands glowed with his blessing. But Ra knew the truth. Every night, when the sun dipped below the horizon and the world surrendered to shadow, his journey would lead him into the underworld. And there, the serpent would be waiting. The descent began slowly. The light dimmed, and the colors of the world bled away. Shadows stretched long, swallowing the edges of the earth. The people of Egypt prayed, their voices trembling, their hands raised to the sky. They knew what lay beneath, the chaos that could shatter their world if Ra failed. The boat slipped into the black waters of the Duat, the underworld, and the silence was deafening. The air grew colder, and even the gods who stood by Ra's side felt the weight of dread. They had fought this battle before. They had seen the fangs of the serpent, felt the pull of its endless hunger. But no matter how many times it was defeated, it always returned, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its chance to strike again. The river twisted and turned, its waters thick and dark, reflecting nothing but emptiness. Strange whispers drifted along the current, voices of the dead, lost and forgotten. The gods ignored them, their eyes fixed ahead. Somewhere in the darkness, the serpent was moving. And then, the water stirred. The surface rippled, and the boat trembled. A shape rose from the depths, massive and coiled, its scales glistening like oil. Apophis emerged, its mouth opening wide, revealing rows of fangs sharp enough to pierce the sky itself. Its hiss echoed through the underworld, a sound that sent chills down the spines of even the bravest gods. Ra stood at the front of the bark, his staff burning with light. He did not flinch. He could not. The sun could not yield to darkness. His light flared, pushing back the shadows, and the serpent recoiled, but only for a moment. Apophis lunged, its jaws snapping, and the battle began. Spears of fire shot from Ra's staff, lighting up the darkness like thunderbolts. The serpent thrashed, its body crashing against the boat, sending waves of black water spilling over the edges. The gods struck with their weapons, slicing at the serpent's scales, but its skin was like iron. It twisted and struck back, knocking one god into the river, dragging him beneath the surface. Ra's light burned brighter, blinding the serpent, forcing it back. But Apophis was not a creature of flesh and blood. It was chaos, given form. It did not bleed, did not tire, did not fear. It lashed out again, wrapping its massive body around the boat, squeezing with crushing force. The wood groaned, splintering under the pressure. The gods fought harder, their cries echoing through the underworld. Ra's fire blazed, setting the serpent's coils alight, but Apophis did not let go. It hissed, its voice filled with rage and hunger. It hated the light. It hated the order Ra brought to the world. And it would do anything to snuff it out. The battle raged on, and the boat rocked violently. Ra's strength began to waver. The darkness pressed closer, and for a moment, it seemed as if the serpent might win. But then, a sound broke through the chaos, a roar, fierce and unyielding. It was Batet, the lioness goddess, her eyes blazing as she leaped onto the serpent's back. Her claws tore into its flesh, and for the first time, Apophis let out a cry of pain. Ra seized the moment. His light flared once more, brighter than ever, flooding the underworld. The serpent writhed, its scales cracking, its body thrashing as the light burned through it. The gods pressed their attack, driving their spears deeper until the serpent released its hold and sank back into the river, hissing and shrieking as it disappeared beneath the surface. But it was not dead. It never died. It retreated, broken and burned, but it would rise again. Ra knew this. The gods knew it too. The battle would come again, night after night, as it always had and always would. Ra's boat sailed out of the underworld, rising toward the horizon. The first rays of dawn touched the earth, and the people of Egypt wept with relief. They had been spared once more. The light had returned. But the battle was far from over. The serpent still waited in the shadows, coiled and hungry, its eyes fixed on the sky. It would wait for nightfall, for the light to fade. And when it did, the struggle would begin again. In the beginning, there was nothing but stillness. The world was a dark, endless ocean, silent and unbroken. No stars pierced the sky. No earth rose above the waters. It was a void so vast and empty that even time seemed afraid to move. But beneath the surface of that endless sea, something stirred, a thought, a will, a longing for life. And from that longing, creation began. The waters trembled as Adam, the first god, rose from the depths. He stood alone, his form glowing with a light that pushed back the shadows. His breath was the first wind, and his voice was the first sound. He looked out at the emptiness and reached into it, pulling forth the earth, the sky, and the stars. With each movement, the void shrank, and the world began to take shape. But Adam was lonely. He gazed across the land he had formed and saw no one to share it with. So, from his own flesh, he created two beings, Shu, the god of air, and Tefnut, the goddess of moisture. They were his children, and he loved them fiercely. Together, they brought balance to the world, separating the heavens from the earth, giving breath to the skies and life to the waters. Yet even in those early days, shadows crept beneath the surface. Shu and Tefnut had children of their own, Geb, the earth, and Nut, the sky, and love grew between them. But their love was forbidden. The sky and the earth could not be joined, for their union threatened to shatter the fragile order Adam had built. When he learned of their desire, his anger shook the heavens. He stretched out his hands and forced them apart, lifting Nut high above Geb, so far that they could never touch. Nut wept, her tears falling as rain, and Geb groaned, his body trembling with grief. But Adam did not waver. He had created order from chaos, and he would not let it fall. Yet the seeds of rebellion had been planted. Nut, though separated from Geb, was pregnant. And in her womb, new gods stirred, children who would shape the fate of the world. Adam, fearing what they might bring, decreed that Nut could not give birth on any day of the year. The sky grew heavy with her cries, and the earth ached for her suffering. But Thoth, the god of wisdom, could not bear to see her pain. He tricked the moon into giving him its light, stealing enough to create 5 extra days that did not belong to any month or year. And on these stolen days, Nut gave birth to her children, Osiris, Isis, Set, Nephthys, and Horus the Elder. Each one carried a spark of divine power, and with their arrival, the world shifted. Osiris was noble and wise, a ruler destined to bring order and justice. Isis was fierce and cunning, her magic unmatched by any god or mortal. Set, however, was restless. His heart burned with storms, and his eyes carried the hunger of the desert. Even as a child, he watched Osiris with jealousy, his fists clenched as the people sang their praises to his brother. It began with whispers, doubts planted like seeds in the cracks of Set's heart. Why did Osiris walk among the people, adored and crowned, while Set roamed the wilds, feared and alone? Why did Isis stand by Osiris's side, their bond unbroken, while Set wandered without love? The shadows in his mind grew darker, twisting his thoughts until they became poison. And so the first cracks appeared. The brothers smiled in public, but in the quiet moments, their eyes burned with unspoken truths. Set's laughter grew sharp, his words heavy with hidden barbs. Osiris stood tall, but there was a weight in his voice, a weariness that he could not hide. The gods felt the tension, like thunder rumbling on the horizon. When Osiris became king of Egypt, Set's fury boiled over. He watched as Osiris brought law to the land, taught the people to farm, and built temples to honor the gods. Everywhere, the name of Osiris was spoken with reverence, and Set's own name was whispered only in fear. The desert winds howled as Set's anger grew, and the first seeds of betrayal took root. But the gods did not see what was coming. They could not imagine the storm that was about to break. Osiris trusted his brother, blinded by love and duty. Isis watched carefully, her heart uneasy, but even she could not stop what was already set in motion. And in the shadows, Set prepared. His hands carved the shape of a coffin, its wood polished and shining. His voice spoke honeyed words, masking the venom that dripped beneath. And when the moment came, when Osiris stood surrounded by those he loved, Set struck. The coffin snapped shut. The cries of the gods rang out, but it was too late. Set's laughter echoed through the halls as the lid was sealed, and Osiris was cast into the Nile. The waters swallowed him, and the world shook. But death was not the end. It never is. The gods looked to Isis, her eyes burning with grief and rage. They saw the rise of Horus, the Avenger, whose cries as a child foretold the battles to come. The world had been broken, but the fight was far from over. And as the sands of time slipped through the fingers of the gods, the echoes of that first betrayal lingered. The creation had begun with love, but the shadows had crept in, and the seeds of rivalry had grown into thorns. The earth and sky remained apart, their longing stretching across the ages. And the gods stood, their hearts heavy, knowing that peace was a fleeting thing. The earth trembled beneath their longing. Geb, the god of the earth, stretched his arms toward the heavens, his fingers aching to touch Nut, the goddess of the sky. She hovered above him, her body arched and painted with stars, but the space between them was an endless void, silent, cruel, and unbroken. Their love was forbidden, yet it burned brighter than the sun. There was a time when they had not been apart. They had lain together, earth and sky entwined, their whispers carried on the wind and their laughter echoing through creation. Their bond had given life to the world, and their union had shaped mountains, rivers, and valleys. But love, even divine love, can stir envy. And envy can shatter worlds. Adam, the Creator, had seen their closeness and felt the weight of danger pressing against his order. The earth and sky were meant to be separate, one below, one above, so that the balance of existence could hold firm. But Geb and Nut defied this design. They clung to each other, their passion so fierce it threatened to unravel the very threads of creation. The judgment fell like a blade. Shu, the god of air and their father, was commanded to tear them apart. He stepped forward, his form towering and unyielding. His breath was the wind, his arms the force of storms. Geb pleaded with him, his voice rumbling like distant thunder. Nut wept, her tears falling as rain. But Shu did not bend. He pressed his hands against Geb's chest and pushed. The earth groaned, cracking and splitting, as Geb was forced downward. His arms clawed at the air, but they could not hold her. Shu's breath swelled, lifting Nut higher and higher until she arched over the world like a dome of sorrow. Her cries filled the heavens, but no one answered. The separation was done. Geb lay below, his back broken by mountains, his body scarred by rivers. Nut stretched above him, her body painted with the stars that now kept them apart. They could see each other but never touch. Their longing seeped into the land, and the world carried the weight of their grief. The gods watched in silence. Some turned away, unable to bear the pain in Nut's eyes as she gazed down at Geb. Others whispered, uneasy, as they felt the earth shudder beneath their feet. Even the winds hesitated, as if unsure whether to carry her cries or drown them. But the decree stood. The earth and sky would remain apart, and their love would remain a wound that could never heal. Yet love does not fade so easily. Even in their separation, Geb and Nut fought against the distance. Nut lowered herself at night, her darkness wrapping the earth in a gentle embrace. Geb stretched upward, his mountains rising as if to brush her skin. Their longing shaped the tides, the rains, and the storms. The world breathed with their ache. But fate was not finished with them. Nut, unable to bear the emptiness, sought comfort in the promise of life. She carried the seeds of new gods, Osiris, Isis, Set, Nephthys, and Horus. Each child carried echoes of her defiance and Geb's strength, their births defying the rules laid down by Adam. The moment Shu learned of her pregnancy, his fury burned like wildfire. He decreed that Nut could not give birth on any day of the year. Time itself conspired against her, trapping her within an eternal cycle where her children could never be born. But Nut was not powerless. Her grief had taught her endurance, and her love had made her fearless. She turned to Thoth, the god of wisdom, and he answered her plea. He tricked the moon into giving up its light, stealing enough to create 5 extra days outside of time's reach. On these stolen days, Nut gave birth. The world shook as Osiris opened his eyes, and the earth trembled as Set took his first breath. The gods stepped back, uneasy, as they saw what had been unleashed. Balance had been broken, and the echoes of that break rippled outward. But Geb and Nut did not regret it. Their children were born of love and defiance, and their presence carved new paths through creation. Yet even as Nut gazed down at her sons and daughters, her heart ached for the touch of Geb. And even as Geb felt the weight of their children's steps upon his back, his longing for Nut never faded. Their separation remained a scar, but it was also a promise, a reminder that love could endure even when torn apart. Their whispers filled the wind, their tears fed the rivers, and their yearning shaped the heavens. And though they could never hold each other again, their story became the heartbeat of the earth and the sky. The scent of blooming lilies filled the air as Osiris stood before his people, his golden skin glistening under the light of Ra's sun. He was a king unlike any the world had seen, kind yet firm, gentle yet strong. The land of Egypt flourished under his touch. Fields of wheat stretched far and wide, rivers danced with life, and the people whispered his name with reverence. To them, Osiris was not just a ruler, he was a savior who brought balance and harmony to a world once swallowed by chaos. But shadows always linger where light shines brightest. Set stood in those shadows, his eyes burning with a fire that no water could quench. He watched his brothers rise with a heart that twisted in rage and bitterness. Osiris's name echoed through the temples, while Set's name fell silent, forgotten like the wind's sigh. He clenched his fists, his nails cutting into his palms, yet the pain did nothing to soothe the storm brewing inside him. Osiris had everything: power, love, admiration, and Set had only the taste of ashes. He could feel it growing, a hunger he could not ignore. It started as a whisper, a thought creeping into his mind like a serpent. Why him? Why Osiris? Was Set not also a god? Was he not worthy of the same worship, the same glory? The serpent's hiss grew louder until it coiled around his heart, sinking its fangs deep. It was Isis, Osiris's queen, who deepened Set's wound. She stood beside Osiris, her beauty radiant, her voice a melody that softened even the hardest souls. But Set was immune to her charm. To him, her presence was salt on his open wounds, a constant reminder of what he lacked. She had chosen Osiris, and in doing so, had sealed Set's fate as the forgotten one, the shadow cast by his brother's brilliance. The jealousy twisted further when Osiris gifted the people with laws and taught them the secrets of farming, trade, and worship. The people built statues in his honor, carved his name into stone, and sang praises that soared into the heavens. Yet Set's name was spoken only in whispers, feared rather than loved. It was not respect, it was dread. One night, as the desert winds howled, Set stood on the cliffs overlooking the Nile. The river glistened under the moonlight, and the shadows of Osiris's temples stretched across the land. Set's eyes burned with fury. He could no longer bear the weight of his brother's shadow. The thought clawed at his mind, Osiris must fall. But Set did not strike in haste. He was a predator, patient and cunning. He smiled when he saw Osiris, laughed at his jokes, and raised his cup in celebration of his brother's victories. Yet beneath that smile, his heart seethed with poison. He planned each step carefully, weaving his web in silence. When the time came, Set crafted a magnificent chest, polished wood, inlaid with gold, and carved with symbols of power. It was a gift fit for a king, and Set knew Osiris could not resist its beauty. He held a great feast, inviting gods and mortals alike, filling the halls with music, wine, and laughter. Osiris, unsuspecting, welcomed the gesture, seeing only the love of a brother and not the venom hidden in Set's eyes. Set stood, raising his cup, and spoke of the gift he had brought for the one who ruled over them with wisdom and grace. He unveiled the chest, and gasps filled the room. It was perfect, crafted to fit Osiris's form as if the gods themselves had shaped it. Set's voice dripped with honey as he proposed a game, a challenge to see who could lie within the chest and fill it completely. One by one, the guests stepped forward, but none fit. Laughter rang out as they tried and failed, until Osiris finally rose, his smile warm and trusting. He stepped into the chest, stretching out his arms, and the room held its breath. It fit perfectly. Before Osiris could rise, the lid slammed shut. The laughter died. Set's eyes gleamed as he poured molten lead over the seams, sealing the chest. Cries erupted as Osiris pounded against the walls, his voice muffled by the gold and wood. Isis screamed, but Set's men dragged her away as he ordered the chest to be cast into the Nile. The waters swallowed Osiris, carrying him away as the stars wept above. The music stopped. The feast turned to mourning. And Set stood at the head of the hall, his shadow stretching long and dark across the stone floor. He had won. Or so he thought. But gods do not die so easily, and love does not fade with death. Isis's tears fell like rain, and her cries shook the heavens. She would search the ends of the earth for Osiris, no matter how many pieces of him had been scattered. Set's triumph tasted sweet for only a moment, but the bitterness soon followed. The gods watched, and the balance shifted. Blood had been spilled, and the echoes of that betrayal would thunder through eternity. The desert wind carried whispers, low, unsettling murmurs that slithered through the shadows. Set stood alone beneath the pale light of the moon, his eyes fixed on the horizon where Osiris's kingdom stretched endlessly. The sands trembled beneath his feet as if they sensed the weight of his thoughts. He clenched his fists, his knuckles white, his breath shallow and sharp. The bitterness inside him had festered long enough. It was no longer a quiet ache. It was rage, boiling, hungry, and unstoppable. He had watched Osiris's rise to glory, seen him crowned as king, and endured the endless praises sung in his honor. Osiris was loved, worshipped even, while Set stood in the corners of temples, carved into statues as a force to be feared, not adored. Every grain of sand seemed to whisper Osiris's name, and every gust of wind carried his voice. It was unbearable. But what Set hated most was the way Osiris trusted him. It was a trust so pure it made Set sick. Osiris had no guards to shield him from his own brother. He greeted Set with open arms, offering smiles and kind words. To Set, those smiles felt like daggers. The softness of Osiris's heart was an insult, a weakness unfit for a king. Set convinced himself that Egypt deserved better, a ruler made of fire and steel, not kindness and mercy. The night before the feast, Set stood in the shadows of Osiris's palace, his heart pounding like war drums. The plan was already in motion. He had called for a celebration, spreading the word that it would honor Osiris's rule. But the feast was a mask, a glittering web designed to catch its prey. Set had spent months crafting the perfect weapon, a chest carved from the finest wood, and laid with gold and precious stones. Its beauty was a trap, and its purpose was death. On the night of the feast, the palace was alive with music and laughter. Torches flickered against the walls, their flames dancing as if mocking the chaos that was about to unfold. Osiris moved through the crowd, his presence like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. He laughed and embraced his people, unaware of the shadows gathering around him. Set watched from across the hall, his pulse quickening. Every step Osiris took brought him closer to the end. The chest gleamed under the light, drawing curious eyes. Set waited until the moment was ripe, then raised his cup and called for silence. "My brother," he said, his voice warm but sharp-edged. "Tonight, we honor you. And as a token of my love, I have prepared a gift, a treasure worthy of a king." The crowd turned as Set unveiled the chest. Gasps rippled through the hall. It was exquisite, its surface polished until it shone like the sun. Osiris's eyes widened, and for a brief moment, Set felt a flicker of doubt. But it vanished as quickly as it came. Set spoke again, his voice laced with sweetness. "Let us play a game. Whoever fits inside this chest may keep it as their own." Laughter erupted as one guest after another climbed into the chest, only to find it too small or too narrow. Set watched with patient eyes, his smile hiding the storm inside him. When it was Osiris's turn, the room fell quiet. Osiris stepped forward, his golden robes trailing behind him. He lowered himself into the chest, stretching his arms to test its fit. It was perfect. For a heartbeat, the room seemed frozen in time. Then the lid slammed shut. Set's men sprang from the shadows, sealing the chest with nails and molten lead. The cries of the crowd were drowned out by the sound of hammers striking metal. Osiris's voice echoed from inside the chest, muffled but frantic. He called out for help, but no one dared to move. Isis screamed, pushing through the crowd, but Set's guards seized her arms, dragging her back. She thrashed against them, her eyes wild with terror. "Stop this," she cried. "Stop this madness." Set turned to her, his expression cold and unyielding. "It is done," he said. The chest was lifted and carried out of the hall. Osiris's voice faded as the doors swung shut behind him. The air grew heavy, suffocating. The music had stopped, and the torches seemed dimmer. Set stood at the center of it all, his shadow stretching long across the floor. He had won. But as the echoes of Osiris's cries lingered, something inside him shifted. The silence felt wrong, unnatural. Outside, the Nile waited, its waters dark and restless. Set's men hurled the chest into the river, and the current swallowed it whole. The ripples spread, as if the water itself mourned what had just happened. But the river did not keep its secrets for long. Far away, Isis began her search, her grief burning brighter than any flame. She would walk the earth, scour the sands, and challenge even the gods to bring Osiris back. Set stood by the water, staring at the spot where the chest had disappeared. The night was still, but he could not silence the sound of Osiris's voice. It echoed in his mind, a ghost that refused to be buried. The river carried him away. The currents pulled the golden chest deeper into its depths, and the world above grew silent. Trapped inside, Osiris felt the walls closing in, the darkness pressing against his skin. His cries were swallowed by the water, fading into nothingness. But his heart still beat. It fought against the suffocating silence, refusing to stop. Far above, Set stood at the riverbank, his eyes fixed on the ripples as they disappeared. But even as the water grew calm, the storm inside him raged. It was not enough. The chest could be found. Osiris could return. And Set could not allow that. He followed the river's path, hunting the chest like a predator stalking its prey. The reeds whispered as he passed, and the wind seemed to carry a warning, but Set did not stop. When he finally found it, wedged between rocks and tangled roots, his eyes burned with triumph. He pulled it from the water, dragging it onto the shore. The wood was swollen, the gold tarnished, but it still held what he feared most: Osiris's body. Set's hands trembled as he pried the lid open. For the first time, he saw his brother lying still, his face pale and cold. But even in death, Osiris looked powerful, his presence heavy in the air. Rage flared in Set's chest. He would not let this be the end. Osiris could not rest. With trembling breath, Set reached for his blade. The metal gleamed under the moonlight, sharp and unforgiving. The first cut was hesitant, but the second came with fury. Flesh parted, and bones cracked under his hands. He worked until his brother was no longer whole, until the pieces lay scattered before him. He had turned a god into fragments, a king into ruins. Set stood over the broken body, his chest heaving. Blood soaked the earth, dark and thick. But even as he looked at the pieces, something stirred in him, a shadow of fear. He gathered them quickly, his hands stained red, and fled into the night. Piece by piece, he carried them away, scattering them across the land. Some he buried in the sand, where no one would think to look. Others he dropped into the Nile, letting the waters carry them far apart. He thought of Isis searching, her tears wetting the ground, and he smiled. She would never find them all. Osiris would remain lost, divided, unfinished. But the earth felt it. The land trembled beneath Set's feet, and the sky dimmed. Crops withered, and rivers ran dry. The balance had been shattered. Life recoiled, as if mourning the god who had given it breath. Isis felt it too. Her cries filled the night, sharp and raw, as she wandered the earth in grief. She searched through the sands, dug through the mud, and combed the riverbanks with trembling hands. Her heart refused to let him go. She would find him, even if it took 1,000 lifetimes. The gods watched in silence as Isis gathered the broken pieces, one by one. She held them close, pressing her tears into the earth as she prayed. Her voice rose to the heavens, calling for help, for mercy. And the earth listened. With the magic of her words, the pieces began to glow. The air trembled, and the fragments stirred. But something was missing. No matter how many pieces she found, there was one she could not reclaim, the heart of Osiris. It had been swallowed by the river, carried far beyond her reach. Isis knelt beside the body, her hands trembling. She had brought him back, but he was not whole. And in that emptiness, Set's shadow lingered, mocking her. But Isis did not give up. She whispered secrets into the wind, called upon powers older than the stars. And the gods answered. They gave Osiris new life, not as a man, but as something eternal. His spirit rose, and his voice returned, stronger than before. Set felt it. The sand shifted beneath his feet, and the winds howled. He looked to the horizon and saw the storm forming, the judgment he had tried to escape. But no matter how far he ran, Osiris's name followed him, whispered by the earth and carried by the wind. And the world, though scarred, began to heal. The rivers flowed again, the crops rose from the soil, and the sun burned brighter in the sky. But the scars remained, etched into the land, carved into the hearts of gods and men. The balance had been restored, but it had come at a cost. And in the shadows, Set watched. He had won the throne, but he had lost the gods. He had scattered the body, but he could not destroy the soul. And as the night stretched on, he felt the weight of what he had done, a weight that no crown could lift. The wind carried their cries through the desert night. Isis knelt in the sand, her trembling hands stained with earth and tears. Her breath came in sharp gasps as she clutched the cold, lifeless fragment of Osiris, the arm she had found buried beneath the reeds. It was heavier than stone, yet it felt hollow in her grasp, as if the life it once held had been ripped away too violently. Her heart ached, but there was no time for despair. Somewhere out there, the rest of him waited. She would not stop until she brought him home. Beside her, Nephthys stood, silent and watchful. Shadows danced across her face, but her eyes burned with the same fire. She had betrayed her husband Set by helping Isis, and there would be no forgiveness if they failed. Yet none of that mattered now. Her loyalty belonged to her sister, to Osiris, and to the broken world left behind in his absence. The night stretched on as they moved through the sands, their footsteps swallowed by the shifting dunes. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the earth itself mourned and tried to hold them back. But Isis would not be stopped. She called out to the wind, to the stars, to any force that would listen. Her voice cracked, but she did not stop. When they reached the banks of the Nile, the moonlight shimmered on the water, turning it silver. Isis waded into the river, her hands trembling as she searched. She dug through mud and reeds, her fingers scraping against stones and roots. Hours passed, and still, she found nothing. Her strength was fading, but she pressed on. Nephthys stepped into the water beside her. She did not speak, but her hands joined the search, steady and sure. The river seemed to pulse, as if it had been waiting for them, and then, beneath the silt and tangled roots, Nephthys touched something smooth and unyielding. They pulled it free, and Isis gasped. It was another piece, Osiris's leg, pale and cold. She clutched it to her chest, her tears falling into the river. The water rippled, and the reeds bent as if bowing to the fallen god. The sisters pressed on, moving from river to desert, from caves to mountains. They searched through ruins and shadows, braving storms and silence. Each discovery came with a mix of joy and sorrow, a triumph tinged with grief. The pieces of Osiris grew heavier, but so did their resolve. There were moments when Isis faltered, when her strength waned, and the weight of her loss threatened to crush her. But Nephthys was always there, steady and unshaken. She touched Isis's shoulder, her voice soft but firm. "He waits for you," Nephthys said. "We cannot let him stay broken." The words gave Isis the strength to stand, to keep searching. Days turned into weeks, and the desert seemed endless, but they refused to stop. They moved through the shadows, hiding from Set's spies and the creatures he had sent to stop them. The sands whispered of betrayal, of treachery and danger, but Isis ignored the voices. She clung to hope as tightly as she clung to the fragments of Osiris. One night, as the stars burned bright above them, they reached the edge of the desert. There, buried beneath the stones, they found the final piece, Osiris's head. Isis fell to her knees, cradling it in her arms. Her tears fell onto his face, tracing the lines of a man who had once ruled with wisdom and kindness. She pressed her forehead against his, whispering words only he could hear. But the pieces were still scattered. Even with all the fragments in their grasp, he was not whole. Isis laid them out carefully, arranging them as if they could come alive simply by touch. The sight of his broken body filled her with sorrow, but she refused to give in to despair. With trembling hands, she began to work. She wrapped the pieces in linen, binding them with prayers and spells older than the stars. Nephthys stood beside her, adding her voice to the chant. The earth seemed to hum in response, and the air grew thick with power. Their voices rose higher, calling to the gods, to the forces that governed life and death. They spoke of love and sacrifice, of a king who had been betrayed but would not be forgotten. The ground trembled beneath them, and the wind howled, but the sisters did not stop. The night stretched on, and the stars seemed to fade. Isis felt her strength leaving her, but she pressed on, pouring her soul into every word. And then, just as the sun began to rise, she felt it. A pulse. Faint but steady. Osiris's body stirred, the linen wrappings shifting as if touched by an invisible hand. Isis fell back, her breath catching in her throat. The light of the morning sun fell on his face, and for the first time, she saw his eyes open. But the moment was fleeting. Though Osiris had returned, he was not as he once was. The magic that had revived him could not fully bind him to the living world. Isis's heart broke again, but she did not cry. She knelt beside him, taking his hand in hers, and whispered promises of vengeance, of justice. Nephthys stepped away, her gaze fixed on the horizon. The sun had risen, but shadows still lingered. Set's power remained strong, and the battle was far from over. But for the first time, there was hope. And as Osiris rose, the earth seemed to breathe again. Flowers bloomed, rivers flowed, and the skies brightened. But the scars of Set's betrayal remained, etched into the land and into their hearts. The sisters stood together, their bond unbroken, as they prepared for what was still to come. The desert winds whispered secrets of vengeance as a child was born beneath a sky stained red by the setting sun. Isis cradled her newborn son, her arms trembling, not from weakness but from the weight of destiny. She knew this boy was not meant for peace. He was born to fight, to rise against the darkness that had torn their family apart. His cries pierced the stillness, fierce and unyielding, as if the gods themselves had answered her prayers. She named him Horus, and in his first breath, she saw the fire of kings. But the world was not safe for him. Shadows circled the edges of their hiding place, and Set's spies searched tirelessly. Isis hid him deep within the marshes, weaving spells around their refuge. She whispered lullabies, but her voice carried words of warning and courage. Every night, she watched the stars and prayed they would not betray their location. Every day, she strengthened the protective barriers, her heart pounding at every unfamiliar sound. Horus grew quickly, his eyes sharp and filled with questions. He was no ordinary child. By the time he could walk, he had learned to move silently through the reeds. By the time he could run, he was already practicing with weapons carved from branches. Isis taught him to see beyond the surface of things, to feel the flow of the river and the pulse of the earth. She told him stories of his father, of Osiris, the just and wise king who had been betrayed. She spoke of Set, the serpent-hearted uncle who had stolen the throne. Horus listened, his small fists tightening with every word. He did not cry. He did not ask why his father could not return. Instead, he vowed to make Set pay. Even as a child, his voice carried the weight of a promise that could not be broken. But Isis knew that anger alone would not win this battle. She trained him not just in strength, but in patience. She taught him how to strike without hesitation and how to wait without fear. Nephthys came often, guiding him in the ways of strategy and deception. They told him that Set was cunning, that he thrived on chaos. To defeat him, Horus would need to be more than a warrior, he would need to be a hunter. Horus grew strong, his muscles hardened by endless hours of training beneath the scorching sun. He wrestled with shadows, imagining Set's face in every opponent. He practiced with spear and bow until his hands bled, refusing to rest even when Isis begged him to. The pain fueled him, reminding him of what had been taken. One night, as the moon hung low and the air grew heavy, Horus stood alone by the river. The water shimmered, and in its reflection, he saw his father's face. Osiris's eyes looked back at him, filled with sorrow and pride. Horus knelt, his heart pounding, and whispered the words he had practiced 1,000 times. I will make him answer for what he's done. The river rippled, as if answering his vow. But the tests were far from over. The gods themselves sent trials to shape him. Serpents slithered into their camp, their fangs dripping with poison. Horus fought them off, his hand steady even as their venom burned his skin. Storms tore through the marshes, flooding their sanctuary, but Horus stood against the raging waters, refusing to be swept away. When the scorpions came, Isis threw herself over him, taking their stings into her own flesh. Horus screamed, his voice raw and desperate, but Isis did not fall. Her magic flared, burning through the poison, and she rose with fire in her eyes. Horus saw her strength and knew it lived within him too. As the years passed, whispers of Horus's existence spread through the land. Set's spies brought word of the boy with the hawk's eyes, and fear crept into their master's heart. Set sent beasts to hunt him, creatures born of nightmares, with claws that tore through stone and teeth that shattered bone. Horus faced them all. He fought with fury and precision, his strikes as swift as the falcon whose name he bore. But victory came at a cost. Each battle left scars on his body and his soul. The weight of his destiny grew heavier, and there were nights when he stood alone, his heart aching with doubt. He questioned whether he could truly defeat Set, whether he could avenge his father's death. It was during one of these nights, as he knelt by the river, that Isis came to him. She placed her hands on his shoulders, her touch gentle but firm. "You are not alone," she said. "Your father's spirit walks with you, and so do I." Her words steadied him, and when he rose, the fire in his eyes burned brighter than ever. He knew there would be no turning back. Horus began to gather allies, warriors who had suffered under Set's rule, those who longed for justice. They pledged their loyalty, their voices echoing through the desert as they swore to fight by his side. The earth seemed to tremble beneath their feet, as if it, too, was waiting for the day of reckoning. The day would come soon. Horus sharpened his blades and strengthened his resolve. He could feel Set's presence, looming like a storm on the horizon. The battle was not just for revenge, it was for balance, for the world his father had built and his mother had protected. And so, as the sun rose over the desert, Horus stood ready. The falcon's shadow stretched long across the sands, a silent warning to the god who had stolen everything. Horus was no longer a child hiding in the marshes. He was a warrior, forged in fire and grief, and the winds carried his name like a battle cry. The desert was silent, holding its breath. The sun, an unblinking eye, hung heavy in the sky as the sands burned beneath it. Two shadows stretched long and sharp across the dunes, one as steady as a mountain, the other shifting like a snake. Horus stood, his spear gripped tightly, his heart pounding like the drums of war. Across from him, Set loomed, his eyes cold and predatory, a smirk curling at the edges of his lips. The air rippled between them, thick with years of hatred and grief. Horus's fingers trembled, but not from fear. The weight of his father's memory pressed against his chest, pushing him forward. Set's gaze flickered, reading the fire in his opponent's eyes, but he did not flinch. He had slain Osiris once, he would crush the sun just as easily. The ground trembled as they circled each other, their footsteps echoing like thunder in the stillness. Horus's breath came fast, but his focus sharpened. He had trained for this moment, carrying the scars of every battle that had led him here. He would not fail. He could not. Set lunged first, his blade slicing through the air, sharp as lightning. Horus dodged, feeling the wind of the strike graze his cheek. Sand erupted around them as their weapons clashed, sparks flying like falling stars. Horus drove forward, forcing Set back with every swing, his muscles straining, his vision narrowing to the man who had torn his family apart. Set laughed, a cruel, hollow sound, and twisted free, striking low and fast. Horus felt pain explode in his side, but he refused to fall. Blood seeped through his armor, but he gritted his teeth and pressed on, his spear darting toward Set's chest. The god of chaos snarled, deflecting the blow, his own blade aimed at Horus's throat. Blow after blow, they fought. Their shadows danced wildly in the sand as the sun sank lower, painting the sky in streaks of fire. Horus's arms burned, his breath ragged, but Set's strikes began to slow. The weight of his arrogance dragged him down, and Horus saw it, the moment of hesitation, the flicker of doubt. Horus attacked, driving Set to the edge of the dunes. Their feet kicked up clouds of sand, but neither looked away. Set's face twisted in rage, his strikes growing desperate. He had ruled for too long, thrived in chaos for too many years, and the thought of losing drove him into a frenzy. But Horus stood firm. He saw his father's face in the fading light, saw the tears his mother had shed, and let the anger rise. With a roar, he knocked Set's blade aside, slamming the hilt of his spear into his enemy's chest. Set staggered, and Horus seized the moment, pinning him to the ground. Set thrashed beneath him, his voice wild with fury. "You think this ends here?" he hissed. "I am chaos. I cannot die." Horus's hands shook, his spear tip pressed against Set's throat. Every part of him screamed to finish it, to end the monster who had torn his world apart. But as he stared into Set's eyes, he saw something unexpected: fear. For the first time, Set's arrogance cracked, and Horus knew he had already won. The wind howled, carrying the cries of gods and men alike. Horus stood tall, the weight of victory pressing down on him. But even as Set's strength faded, Horus felt no joy. The battle had been won, but the scars it left would never fade. Blood stained the sand, and the sun dipped below the horizon, leaving shadows to creep across the earth once more. The hall of the gods stretched endlessly, its towering columns disappearing into shadows above. Torches burned along the walls, their flickering flames unable to chase away the weight of judgment that hung in the air. The gods sat in their thrones, carved from stone and gold, their faces unmoving as the echoes of the battle still seemed to hum through the air. The scent of incense filled the chamber, but it did little to mask the tension. Horus knelt before them, his body bruised and bloodied from the fight, but his head was high. His heart pounded, not with fear, but with the ache of what had been lost. Beside him, Set stood defiant, his armor stained with sweat and sand, his eyes sharp and unyielding. He showed no remorse, only the stubbornness of a god who refused to fall. Ra, the sun god, sat at the center, his gaze heavy and ancient. He looked from one to the other, his voice like thunder when he spoke. The battle has been fought, but the throne of Egypt must not be won by force alone. The gods will decide. The chamber fell silent. Even the flames seemed to shrink. Thoth stepped forward, the keeper of wisdom, his eyes unreadable. Justice must guide this decision, he said, his words slow, deliberate. But justice is no simple blade. It must cut through the lies, the anger, and the pride. Set's lips curled. Justice? His voice slithered through the hall. Was it justice when Horus stole what was mine? Was it justice when my brother betrayed me first? Horus clenched his fists, his knuckles white. You speak of betrayal? You tore Osiris apart. You scattered his body like dust and called it your right. His voice cracked, but he did not lower it. You defiled the earth and called it power. You are chaos, and chaos cannot rule. Set stepped closer, his shadow looming. And what are you, Horus? A boy chasing a crown he has not earned? A son clinging to the memory of his father? The god stirred. Mutters rippled through them like distant thunder. Some nodded in approval at Horus's strength, others saw Set's cunning and doubted the boy could match it. Isis rose from her place, her voice sharp yet trembling. Do not let the lies of Set poison this hall. Horus has proven himself, not just through strength, but through mercy. He had the chance to end Set and chose to spare him. Is that not the mark of a ruler? Set snarled. Mercy is weakness. A king must be feared. He must break those who defy him, not pity them. Osiris's voice, low and steady, filled the hall. A king must protect his people, not destroy them. You, Set, shattered the balance. You brought shadows where light should have ruled. Horus stands here not because he seeks vengeance, but because he seeks to heal what you have broken. The words struck like hammers against stone. Set's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Ra stood, his golden staff gleaming as the flames reflected off it. Enough, he said, his voice final. The gods must see beyond the battle. We must weigh not just who fought, but why. He looked to Horus. Do you seek power for revenge or for peace? Horus swallowed hard. His wounds throbbed, his heart raced, but his voice did not waver. I seek to restore what was stolen. Not for me, but for my father, for my mother, and for the land that cries out for order. Ra turned to Set. And you? What drives your claim? Set's eyes burned. I was born to rule. The chaos I bring is not destruction, it is strength. It is what Egypt needs to survive. The gods fell into murmurs again, their voices rising and falling like waves crashing against the shore. Some favored Horus's calm and justice, others saw Set's fire as necessary for survival. The debate dragged on, and the tension grew heavier with every word. At last, Ma'at, the goddess of truth, stood. Her feather of balance gleamed in the dim light. Enough words, she said softly, but her voice cut through the noise. We are not here to serve pride or anger. We are here to serve the balance. She turned to Horus and Set. Both of you stand as gods, but only one may sit as king. She placed the feather in the scales, and the chamber grew silent as the weight of judgment began to tip. Horus's breath caught. Set's jaw tightened. The gods leaned forward, their eyes fixed on the scales as if the world itself hung in the balance. The feather trembled. The scales shifted. And in that moment, the silence broke, not with words, but with the sharp crack of fate snapping into place. The decision had been made. The sun slipped beneath the horizon, and the world exhaled. Darkness crept across the sands, swallowing the golden glow that had bathed the earth. Yet far beneath the surface, in the shadowed veins of the underworld, the night was not a time for rest. It was a battlefield. R.A. stood at the helm of his solar bark, his form blazing with light that defied the suffocating dark pressing in from every side. The river of the underworld twisted ahead, black and endless, its waters rippling as unseen things stirred beneath the surface. Shadows writhed along the walls, stretching like claws, as if trying to drag him down. The air was thick, pulsing with dread. And then it came, the hiss that sent chills through even the gods. Apophis. The serpent of chaos, larger than the bark itself, rose from the depths. Its scales shimmered like oil, its eyes burning pits of hatred. Its jaws unhinged, revealing fangs long enough to shatter the heavens. The underworld trembled at its presence, and the waters churned as it moved. The gods aboard the bark tensed. Set, the fierce warrior, gripped his spear, his muscles rigid. Batet sharpened her claws, her eyes gleaming like twin moons. Thoth murmured spells, his voice steady even as his hands trembled. They had faced Apophis before, but tonight felt different. Tonight, the shadows seemed thicker. Apophis lunged. Its massive coils slammed into the boat, and the entire vessel rocked, tilting dangerously. Water sprayed into the air, hissing as it touched the divine light surrounding R.A. The gods leapt into action. Set's spear struck first, piercing one of the serpent's scales, but it barely flinched. It twisted and snapped, its fangs scraping against the bark's hull, leaving deep grooves in the enchanted wood. R.A. raised his staff, and light erupted from its tip, driving back the shadows. The serpent recoiled, hissing as its skin sizzled under the radiance. But Apophis did not retreat, it surged forward again, enraged. Batet moved like a shadow, clawing at the serpent's face, drawing dark ichor that hissed as it hit the ground. Thoth's voice grew louder, his spells weaving threads of light that wrapped around Apophis's coils, binding it for a moment, but only a moment. With a violent thrash, it shattered the bindings and lunged again, faster this time. The bark shuddered. Ra's light dimmed for the briefest moment, and the gods froze. They knew what failure would mean. If Apophis devoured the bark, the sun would never rise. The world above would drown in eternal night. Crops would wither, rivers would dry, and the souls of the dead would wander lost, unable to find peace. R.A. gripped his staff tighter. Sweat glistened on his brow, but his eyes burned with resolve. He would not let chaos win. Set roared, hurling his spear with all his strength. It drove deep into Apophis's jaw, pinning it for just long enough. R.A. stepped forward, raising his staff high. Light poured out of him, blinding and pure. It shot into the serpent's gaping mouth, burning its throat, searing its flesh. Apophis thrashed, writhing in agony, its shriek splitting the air. The river boiled. The shadows screamed and scattered. The gods pressed forward, their weapons striking as one, pushing Apophis back, inch by inch. The serpent's coils tightened around the boat, crushing it, but R.A. did not falter. With one final burst of light, the serpent collapsed. Its body fell into the river, sinking beneath the black waves, its hiss fading into silence. The bark steadied. The gods stared at the waters, waiting, but Apophis did not rise. For now. R.A. did not lower his staff. He knew this victory was only borrowed time. Apophis could not be killed, not truly. Chaos could never be destroyed, only beaten back. And tomorrow night, it would return, stronger and angrier. The god sagged with exhaustion, but R.A. remained standing, his light still burning. The river stretched ahead, endless, and he guided the bark forward. The underworld was vast, and there were still many dangers waiting in the dark. But the sun would rise. For one more day. The air felt heavy, as if the world itself held its breath. Silence stretched, vast and endless, before the first crack shattered the stillness. It began as a tremor, faint but growing, like the pulse of something ancient stirring beneath the earth. And then came the sound, a low, guttural growl that rumbled through the heavens and shook the ground. The skies darkened. Shadows stretched unnaturally, twisting and writhing as if they had lives of their own. From the depths of the unseen, Isfit rose. Chaos. It slithered and hissed, unseen but felt, like cold fingers brushing against the soul. Its presence bled into the world, warping it, twisting order into madness. Rivers churned backward. Crops withered in their fields. The sun faltered, its golden light dimming as if it feared to shine. And yet, in the heart of the storm, a single feather floated. White, weightless, unyielding. Mayat. Harmony stood where chaos sought to devour. The feather, delicate yet eternal, glowed faintly against the growing darkness. It was more than a symbol, it was a force. It was the breath of truth, the pulse of balance that held the universe together. Without it, the world would shatter into endless fragments, drowning in its own madness. Isfit roared. It tore through the heavens, its voice like thunder and breaking stone. Its tendrils lashed out, twisting themselves around the edges of existence, trying to pull everything into its gaping maw. It sought to devour the light, to drown the feather in shadows. But Mayat did not flinch. The priests whispered her name, their voices trembling but resolute. The scribes drew her image, their ink-staining papyrus with prayers older than memory. And the gods stood in defiance, their weapons raised, their hearts burning with purpose. Ra's bark sailed through the chaos, its light cutting paths where shadows tried to close in. Set stood on its bow, his spear glowing as he fought off the serpent Apophis, the very essence of Isfit. Each thrust and strike rang out like thunder, but the shadows swarmed, endless and hungry. The scales of judgment trembled, teetering between light and dark. The feather of Mayat lay on one side, perfect and still, while the weight of Isfit pressed down on the other, threatening to tip the balance. Souls of the dead waited in silent fear, their fates bound to the outcome of this ancient war. Isfit pressed harder, its voice rising in fury. Lies slithered through the air, twisting truths into poison. Fear grew, spreading like wildfire. Order cracked. Laws bent. Chaos tasted victory, and the earth trembled under its hunger. But Mayat's light refused to break. The feather glowed brighter, its brilliance cutting through the lies and exposing them. It unraveled the twisted shadows, stripping them down to their hollow cores. The gods chanted her name, their voices rising above the storm. Truth echoed through the heavens, steady and unbroken. Thoth stepped forward, his scroll in hand. Words of law poured from his lips, weaving spells that bound the chaos in place. Batet roared, her claws ripping through the tendrils that tried to choke the light. Osiris rose from the underworld, his presence steady as stone, guarding the gates that chaos sought to shatter. And then came the judgment. The feather lifted, light as breath, and balance tipped. The shadows recoiled, howling as they crumbled into dust. Isfit shrieked, its form unraveling, its strength broken. But it did not die. It could not die. Chaos was eternal, just as order was eternal. They would always fight, locked in their endless struggle, each pushing against the other. The gods did not celebrate. Their faces were grim, their eyes fixed on the horizon, where the shadows lingered, waiting. They knew this was only one battle in an eternal war. Tomorrow, Isfit would rise again, and Mayat would stand to meet it. And the world would hold its breath once more. The earth trembled beneath her feet. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of blood and smoke. Cries echoed in the distance, some pleading, some dying, and others already silent. Hathor stood at the edge of the world, her eyes burning with fire, her breath sharp and wild. The goddess, once gentle and radiant, had become something unrecognizable. Her skin gleamed like molten gold, and her gaze cut through flesh and bone. It began with whispers. Men, proud and arrogant, dared to mock the gods. They questioned Ra's power, ridiculed his light, and called themselves the masters of the earth. The heavens heard their laughter, and Ra's heart grew heavy with rage. The Creator, whose hands shaped the skies and rivers, watched his children drift into rebellion. Their defiance spread like rot, and the balance he had worked to protect began to crack. Ra's anger turned cold. He looked down at the world and saw greed and betrayal blooming like poison. Justice, he decided, must come. He called upon Hathor, the Eye of Ra. She stepped forward, her beauty glowing like dawn, her presence soft as morning light. But behind her smile, something stirred. A hunger. A storm. Ra's voice thundered through the heavens. Show them my wrath. Let them know fear. Hathor bowed her head, her lips curved in a gentle smile. And then she descended. The earth welcomed her like a queen, but she did not come in peace. Her laughter rang through the fields as her steps turned rivers red. The earth cracked beneath her rage, and her hands tore through villages like fire through dry grass. Her eyes blazed as men fled before her, but no prayer could stop her. She had become Sekhmet, the lioness, the destroyer. She hunted with the hunger of a beast. Blood stained her lips, and the cries of the dying only fueled her fire. She found no joy, no mercy. Only fury. Her claws ripped through flesh, and her roar shook the skies. The earth could not hold her, and the rivers ran dark as her shadow fell over the land. The people scattered like leaves, but there was no place to hide. Mothers clutched their children, shielding them with trembling hands. Warriors fell to their knees, begging for mercy, but none came. Sekhmet's thirst grew. She drank deeply from the rivers of blood, her hunger unending. Ra watched from above. His eyes, once filled with righteous anger, now burned with regret. The earth he had created was drowning in sorrow. But Sekhmet did not stop. Her rage had consumed her. She no longer killed for justice, she killed because she could. The gods whispered among themselves. Fear gripped their hearts. The lioness could not be tamed. She had become a force of chaos, and even Ra's light seemed too faint to reach her. Ra's voice called out, trembling. Enough. But she did not hear him. The blood had deafened her, and the hunger would not let her rest. Desperation took hold. Ra's servants poured red wine into the rivers, their hands shaking as they worked. The water turned crimson, thick and rich, like blood. When Sekhmet came, she drank deeply, mistaking it for the lifeblood she craved. The wine burned through her veins, dulling the fire in her heart. Her steps slowed. Her breath softened. And the lioness stumbled, her rage melting into sleep. The earth exhaled. The fire smoldered, and the rivers began to clear. But the silence that followed was heavy. The people, broken and hollow-eyed, dared not speak. They had seen the face of wrath. They had felt the sharpness of divine anger, and though the lioness slept, her shadow lingered. Sekhmet's rampage left scars that could not be erased. The fields would bloom again, but the earth would never forget the taste of blood. Her name became a warning, whispered in prayers and carved into stone. And though she returned to her place beside Ra, her hunger remained, a fire buried beneath the surface, waiting. The ground was soaked in red. It flowed in streams, thick and warm, carrying the echoes of screams that had long faded. The earth drank deeply, but it was never enough. Sekhmet moved through the carnage, her golden skin streaked with blood, her eyes wild and unblinking. She had tasted rage, and it had made her strong. Her breath came in sharp bursts, heavy with the scent of death. She was no longer a goddess. She was a storm that could not be stopped. Her roar tore through the skies, shaking the heavens themselves. Bodies lay broken beneath her feet, and still, her hunger burned. She had become the embodiment of wrath, a force that devoured without pause. The humans had dared to defy the gods, and she had been sent to punish them. But punishment had turned to slaughter, and slaughter had become a feast. Ra watched from above, his heart heavy with fear. This was not the justice he had commanded. This was chaos. His creation was drowning in blood, and Sekhmet would not stop. Her thirst was endless. Her joy was cruel. He could see it in her eyes, the fire that would burn until there was nothing left. Desperation clawed at him. He could not strike her down. She was his eye, his fury given form. But he also could not let the world fall beneath her claws. He turned to the gods, his voice trembling. She must be stopped. But none dared approach her. Even the strongest gods feared her wrath. She had become a lioness, unstoppable and untamed. To stand before her was to be torn apart. Ra's mind raced. He could not overpower her, but perhaps he could outwit her. He ordered his servants to gather barley and red ochre. They worked through the night, grinding, mixing, and shaping. They poured rivers of beer, thick and frothy, and dyed it the color of blood. When the sun rose, the fields shimmered with red. The rivers had turned crimson, reflecting the light like fire. It looked as though the earth itself had opened its veins. From above, Ra called out to Sekhmet, his voice echoing through the sky. "There is more," he said. "More blood. Drink." Sekhmet paused, her golden eyes narrowing. The scent of blood called to her, sweet and rich. She stepped forward, her claws sinking into the wet soil. She bent low, her tongue flicking against the surface. The taste filled her mouth, hot and thick, and she drank. She drank deeply, her hunger driving her. The red liquid poured down her throat, warming her chest, calming the fire that raged within. She drank until her breath slowed, until her steps faltered. Her vision blurred, and the earth seemed to spin beneath her. The gods watched in silence as she staggered, her roar fading to a low growl. Her legs gave out, and she collapsed into the river of red, her golden form sinking into the flood. Sleep took her. Her breath came soft and steady, her body still. The lioness had been tamed, but the earth bore the scars of her wrath. Fields lay in ruin, and rivers still carried the scent of blood. The people emerged from their hiding places, their eyes hollow and wide. They stepped carefully, their feet sinking into the soaked earth. They did not speak. They only stared at the goddess who had nearly destroyed them. Ra lowered his gaze, his heart heavy with what had been done. The flood of blood would fade, but the memory would linger. Sekhmet would awaken, but the hunger would always be there, just beneath the surface. And the world would never forget the day it drowned in her wrath. The air was heavy, crackling with tension. Darkness stretched its claws across the horizon as Set moved through the shadows, his eyes burning with malice. His footsteps were slow, deliberate, like a predator stalking prey. Chaos followed him, curling in tendrils around the sand, whispering promises of ruin. He thrived in disorder, feeding off fear, twisting fate to suit his will. But Set was not alone. A figure stood in his path, calm and unyielding. Thoth, the keeper of wisdom, faced him without flinching. His eyes gleamed like stars piercing through the gloom. He carried no weapon, only words sharp enough to cut deeper than any blade. Set sneered. "Step aside," he growled. "You cannot stop me." Thoth did not move. His voice was steady, yet it carried the weight of thunder. "I will not let you destroy what has been built." Set's laughter echoed, sharp and cold. "Built," he mocked. "What has been built is weak. It trembles beneath my touch. It begs to be torn apart." Thoth's gaze did not waver. "And yet you fear my words more than any sword. You know what I can do." Set's grin faltered for just a moment, but his arrogance swelled. He lunged, claws slicing through the air, but Thoth did not flinch. With a single word, Thoth summoned the wind, twisting it into an invisible wall. Set's attack stopped mid-air, the force of his rage scattering like dust. Set roared, his voice shaking the earth. "You think tricks will save you?" Thoth stepped closer, his footsteps soft against the sand. "Not tricks. Truth." His voice was calm, but his words struck like lightning. "Truth binds what you seek to unravel. It is stronger than your chaos." Set's fury burned hotter, but Thoth's presence wrapped around him like a net, tightening with every word. Set clawed at the invisible threads, but they did not break. "You cannot trap me forever." Set spat, his voice trembling. Thoth's eyes narrowed. "Forever is not my weapon. Wisdom is. And it will outlast your storms." Set lashed out again, but Thoth's words circled him, turning his rage into confusion. The more Set fought, the tighter the snare became. His strength began to waver, and for the first time, he felt the weight of defeat pressing against him. Thoth stepped closer, his voice softer now, but no less powerful. You call yourself chaos, but chaos is blind. It cannot see the paths that wisdom charts. You have lost before the battle began. Set stumbled, his breath ragged. The shadows around him began to thin, retreating from the light that poured from Thoth's words. Desperation twisted Set's face, but Thoth's gaze held steady. Yield, Thoth said, his voice low but commanding. Set's growl faded into a whisper. He sank to one knee, the fire in his eyes dimming. For the first time, his voice cracked. This is not the end, he said. Thoth's lips curled into a faint smile. No, he agreed. It is only the beginning. And with that, Set vanished into the darkness, leaving Thoth standing beneath the stars. The silence that followed was not empty but alive, filled with the echoes of a battle that had been fought not with strength, but with the unyielding power of wisdom. The air hung heavy, thick with the scent of earth and ancient stone. Shadows stretched long and thin across the sacred tomb, flickering like restless spirits. At the heart of the darkness, Anubis stood, his jackal-headed figure motionless but watchful. His eyes, dark and piercing, glowed faintly as they swept across the chamber. The silence was alive, whispering secrets of the dead and the weight of promises made long ago. Beneath the earth, Osiris lay in eternal rest, his body preserved, his soul lingering in the underworld. Anubis guarded him, not out of duty, but out of devotion. He had prepared the body with his own hands, sealing every cut, wrapping each strip of linen with care. It was not mere preservation, it was love, a silent vow to protect Osiris even beyond death. And now, something stirred in the shadows. A low growl echoed through the chamber, and Anubis turned sharply. He knew that sound. It carried rage and hunger, chaos and ruin. Set had come. The god of storms emerged from the gloom, his form towering, wild eyes burning like fire. His breath rattled, sharp and heavy. Anubis did not move, but his heart quickened. Set's presence was raw and violent, like a storm rolling in overcome waters. You don't belong here, Anubis said, his voice low but unshaken. Set's lips curled into a sneer. And yet, here I stand. Anubis stepped forward, his claws clicking softly against the stone. Leave. Set laughed, a jagged sound that echoed off the walls. You guard a corpse, Anubis. What good is devotion to the dead? Osiris is gone, and his kingdom will crumble. Step aside, and I might let you remain in the shadows where you belong. Anubis bared his teeth, a deep growl rumbling in his throat. I will never step aside. Set lunged, his movements fast and brutal. Anubis met him without hesitation, their clash shaking the tomb. Claws scraped against stone, and dust rained down like ash. Anubis fought with precision, his strikes sharp and deliberate. Set was wild, chaotic, his strength fueled by rage. Blows landed hard. Anubis felt the sting of claws raking his side, but he did not falter. He moved like the shadows themselves, slipping just beyond Set's reach before striking back. Blood stained the ground, but neither god yielded. You can't protect him. Set roared, his voice thunderous. He's already mine. Anubis's eyes burned brighter. No, he growled. He is beyond your reach. With a sudden burst of speed, Anubis struck, his claws tearing through Set's flesh. The storm god howled, staggering back. Anubis pressed forward, his breath ragged but steady. You may bring chaos, Anubis said, his voice sharp as a blade, but death does not bow to you. Set snarled, his fury boiling over. He lunged again, but Anubis met him with an unyielding force. The fight raged on, echoing through the depths of the earth. Dust choked the air, and cracks split the walls, but Anubis did not waver. Set's strength began to falter. His movements slowed, his breaths coming in short, sharp bursts. Anubis saw it, the moment the storm began to break. He struck hard, forcing Set to stumble. The god of chaos fell to one knee, his chest heaving. "Stay down," Anubis commanded, his voice trembling with restrained fury. Set glared up at him, hatred burning in his eyes. But there was fear, too. For the first time, he saw the immovable will of the jackal god, the silent strength that could not be broken. Anubis stepped closer, his shadow stretching over Set like the night itself. "You will never touch him," he said. "Not in life, not in death." Set's lips curled, but no words came. He staggered to his feet and backed away, his body bruised and bleeding. Anubis watched him go, his heart pounding but steady. The chamber fell silent once more. Anubis turned back to the resting place of Osiris, his breath slowing. He touched the sarcophagus, his claws brushing gently against the stone. The shadows seemed to draw closer, wrapping around him like a shroud. But Anubis did not fear them. He stood as he always had, unyielding, a sentinel of the dead. The darkness was his ally, and as long as he stood, no chaos could claim what had been entrusted to him. The desert winds screamed like tortured souls, twisting through the night with an eerie howl. The air was thick with tension, as if the earth itself held its breath. Somewhere in the distance, the low rattle of scales against stone broke the silence, a sound so faint yet sharp, it sliced through the stillness like a knife. Shadows writhed, long and snake-like, slithering across the sand. They moved with purpose, weaving patterns of dread that seemed to creep closer with every passing moment. Batet stood at the edge of the darkness, her feline eyes burning like twin embers. Her sleek form shimmered under the pale light of the moon, but there was nothing soft about her stance. Her claws were unsheathed, and her muscles coiled beneath her skin like steel cords. She could feel them, creatures born of venom and malice, their presence tainting the ground they slithered upon. The serpents of chaos were coming. The first one struck without warning, lunging from the shadows with fangs bared. Batet moved faster than thought, her body a blur of motion. Her claws sliced through the air, meeting the serpent's head mid-strike. A sickening hiss erupted as the beast recoiled, black blood spraying across the sand. But there was no time to breathe. Another serpent lunged, and then another. They poured from the darkness like a river of nightmares, their bodies coiling and uncoiling with unnatural speed. Batet spun, dodging and striking with lethal precision. Each blow was swift and deliberate, tearing through scales and flesh, but the serpents kept coming. Their eyes glowed with hunger, and their hisses filled the air like whispers of doom. Batet could feel their hatred pressing against her, thick and suffocating. These were no ordinary beasts. They were the embodiment of chaos, twisted forces born to unravel order and drown the world in darkness. A serpent coiled around her leg, its fangs snapping dangerously close. Batet snarled, her claws ripping into its flesh. She felt its body shudder before it fell limp, but already another serpent lunged from behind. She twisted, barely avoiding its bite. Her heart pounded, but her movements never faltered. She was a warrior, a protector, and she would not yield. The sand beneath her feet grew slick with blood, and the air stank of venom. Her breath came in sharp bursts, but her eyes never lost their fire. The serpents circled, their bodies weaving patterns of terror, but Batet stood her ground. She could not let them pass. Behind her, the pharaoh's chambers lay silent, and beyond them, an entire kingdom slept, unaware of the danger that slithered toward them. Bastet's ears twitched. A low rumble vibrated through the ground, and she knew what it meant. The largest serpent was coming. The others were merely its shadows, distractions to weaken her before its arrival. Her claws flexed, and she turned toward the darkness. It emerged slowly, its massive form stretching endlessly across the sand. Its scales shimmered like obsidian, and its eyes burned with an unnatural light. It was a serpent born of nightmares, ancient and unrelenting. It reared back, its fangs dripping venom that sizzled as it touched the ground. Batet didn't hesitate. She charged. The serpent struck, its jaws snapping shut with a sound like thunder. Batet leaped, twisting in the air to avoid its bite. Her claws raked across its face, tearing through scales and leaving jagged lines of crimson. The serpent hissed in fury, lashing out again, but Batet was already moving. She danced around its attacks, her body fluid and deadly. Every strike drew blood, but the serpent refused to fall. It towered over her, its coils wrapping tighter, cutting off her space. Bastet's breaths grew sharper, but she did not stop. She could not stop. The serpent lunged, and this time, its fangs grazed her shoulder. Pain flared, white-hot and searing, but Batet didn't cry out. She used the momentum, spinning and driving her claws deep into its neck. The serpent thrashed, its body crashing against the earth, but Batet held on, her grip unyielding. Venom burned through her veins, but she dug deeper, her claws tearing through muscle and bone. The serpent's hisses turned to shrieks, and its body began to convulse. Batet let go just as it collapsed, its massive form crumbling into the sand. The silence that followed was deafening. Batet stood over the corpse, her body trembling but unbowed. Blood stained her fur, and her breaths came in sharp gasps, but her eyes burned with triumph. The serpents of chaos lay defeated, their bodies scattered across the sands like broken shadows. But Batet did not celebrate. She turned her gaze toward the horizon, where the first light of dawn began to creep across the sky. The sun's rays kissed the earth, pushing back the darkness, but Batet knew the battle was far from over. Chaos would return, as it always did. And when it did, she would be ready. The sky burned red as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the golden sands. A hush fell over the gathered soldiers, their eyes fixed on the lone figure standing at the edge of the battlefield. The pharaoh's silhouette rose like a god carved from stone, his spear gleaming in the fading light. Behind him, banners snapped in the wind, their symbols carrying prayers to the heavens. The earth trembled beneath their feet, but the pharaoh did not move. He stood as if he were a force of nature, unyielding and eternal. The night carried whispers of fear. Chaos had stirred again. The serpents of darkness slithered through the unseen corners of the world, and shadows stretched long and hungry. It was not just men who fought this battle. The gods themselves watched through unseen eyes, their will flowing through the veins of the pharaoh. He was not merely a man. He was the living breath of Horus, the falcon-eyed protector who soared above both earth and sky. The soldiers knelt as the pharaoh raised his hand. Silence fell like a weight. They saw in him something greater than flesh, a spark of divinity, a thread connecting the mortal world to the eternal realm of gods. To them, he was the blade that cut through chaos, the shield that turned away the darkness. And tonight, that darkness pressed closer than ever before. The enemy came like a storm. Hooves thundered, and the ground shook with the march of countless feet. The air grew thick with the scent of sweat and blood. The enemy carried the mark of Set, the god of storms and disorder. Their banners bore symbols of snakes and jackals, and their cries pierced the air like shrieks of vultures. The pharaoh stepped forward. His armor glinted like sunlight on the Nile, and his headdress bore the serpent that marked him as Ra's chosen. He moved with purpose, his footsteps echoing like the beats of war drums. In his hand, he held a staff carved with the symbols of power, and around his neck hung the amulet of Ma'at, the goddess of truth and balance. The first arrow flew, cutting the air with deadly speed. The pharaoh raised his shield, and the impact rang out like thunder. But he did not falter. With a cry that shook the heavens, he charged, his spear thrusting forward like lightning. Behind him, his men surged, their voices rising in a roar that drowned out fear. The battle raged. Spears clashed, and swords rang against shields. Dust choked the air, but the pharaoh's eyes cut through it all. He moved with precision, striking down enemies as if guided by divine hands. Arrows fell like rain, but none touched him. His enemies saw more than a man, they saw a figure bathed in light, a warrior wrapped in the fire of the gods. One by one, the enemy fell, their cries fading beneath the roar of the advancing army. The pharaoh pressed forward, his spear finding its mark again and again. Blood stained the sand, but he did not stop. He could not stop. He had sworn an oath to the gods, and their voices rang in his ears, urging him onward. A sudden tremor split the earth. From the shadows rose a figure cloaked in smoke, its eyes burning with malice. It was no man. It was chaos given form, a beast that carried the mark of Set. Its body twisted and shifted, scales glinting in the dim light. It opened its jaws, and the sound that emerged was not human. The soldiers froze, their weapons trembling in their hands. But the pharaoh did not waver. He stepped forward, his spear aimed at the heart of the beast. The creature lunged, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. The pharaoh's voice rang out, calling on the strength of Ra, and his spear found its mark. The beast shrieked, its body convulsing as light poured from its wound. The ground split, and the shadows recoiled, fleeing before the rising sun. The soldiers watched in awe as the beast crumbled, its form dissolving into dust. But the pharaoh did not lower his spear. He turned, his eyes scanning the battlefield, and raised his hand once more. His soldiers fell to their knees, bowing before him. He was no longer just a king. He was the bridge between men and gods, the one who stood against chaos and brought order to the world. As the first rays of dawn touched the horizon, the pharaoh stood tall. His armor was stained with blood, but his eyes burned with the fire of the divine. He knew the battle was not over. Chaos would rise again, as it always did. But so would he. For he was chosen, and the gods would fight through him as long as he drew breath. The desert winds carried his name across the sands, a whisper that grew louder with each passing moment. To his people, he was more than a ruler. He was the shield that guarded their souls, the sword that struck down their fears. And as the sun climbed higher, its light seemed to linger on him, as if even Ra himself bowed to the king who had become a god. The river ran red as the cries of warriors echoed through the mist. Spears clashed against shields, and the air smelled of iron and fire. The Nile, which had carried life to the people of Egypt for centuries, now bore witness to death. At its banks, bodies fell like broken reeds, and the waters swallowed them without mercy. Yet amid the chaos, there was a figure who stood unshaken, his eyes sharp as a falcon's. He was the pharaoh, and in his veins pulsed the blood of Horus. The enemy surged forward, their banners snapping in the wind, their faces painted with rage and hunger. They came not just for land, but for dominion over Egypt's soul. The pharaoh knew this battle was not his alone. It was a battle of gods, a struggle between light and shadow. He raised his weapon, and in that moment, he felt the weight of Horus upon him. It was not just a presence, it was a force that burned through his body, sharpening his vision and steadying his hand. The enemy drew closer. Arrows whistled through the air, and shields rattled like drums. The pharaoh's soldiers braced themselves, but their breaths were heavy with fear. The enemy seemed endless, their numbers stretching to the horizon. Doubt crept into the ranks like a serpent. Yet the pharaoh did not waver. He called out, his voice ringing above the noise. "Horus is with us." The word struck like thunder, shaking the hearts of his men. They gripped their weapons tighter, their eyes fixed on him. He raised his sword high, and the sun glinted off its edge. It was not just a blade, it was a promise, a declaration that light would not fall to darkness. The charge began. The earth trembled as feet pounded forward, and the sound of war filled the air. The pharaoh led them, his steps unyielding, his strike swift. Blood splattered across the sand, and cries of agony pierced the heavens. But through the chaos, the pharaoh moved as if guided by unseen hands. He saw enemies before they struck, dodging blows with an instinct that felt unnatural. His sword found gaps in armor as though it knew where to cut. It was as if Horus himself fought beside him, whispering through the winds, guiding every motion. The enemy faltered. They had believed the pharaoh to be just a man, but now they saw something else. His movements were too sharp, his eyes too fierce. He was no mortal, he was the vessel of a god. Fear rippled through their ranks, and the pharaoh pressed harder. Then the ground shook. From the ranks of the enemy, a giant rose, a warrior clad in blackened armor, his spear taller than any man. His helmet bore the mark of Set, and his presence seemed to draw shadows toward him. He strode through the battlefield, cutting down soldiers as though they were made of clay. The pharaoh saw him and stepped forward. The air grew heavier. It was not just flesh and steel that clashed now, it was order against chaos, light against darkness. The warrior roared, his spear driving toward the pharaoh like a serpent's fawn. The pharaoh moved, and his shield caught the blow. The impact rang out, but he did not fall. Instead, he pushed back, his sword slicing through the air. The giant twisted away, but the blade found its mark, carving through armor and flesh. The warrior stumbled, and the pharaoh struck again, this time driving his blade deep. The giant fell, and for a moment, there was silence. Then the enemy broke. Their cries turned to screams of panic as they fled toward the river, their banners falling like leaves. The soldiers of Egypt pursued them, their spirits burning with the fire of victory. But the pharaoh stood still, his chest rising and falling, his gaze fixed on the sky. A falcon circled overhead, its wings cutting through the clouds. It was not an ordinary bird. It was Horus, watching, guarding. The pharaoh bowed his head, and the falcon cried out, its voice echoing across the battlefield. The Nile flowed once more, washing away the blood. The earth drank deeply, as if cleansing itself of the chaos that had tainted it. The soldiers knelt before their king, but he did not raise his arms in triumph. He simply looked to the horizon, where the sun began to rise. He knew this battle would not be the last. Shadows would return, as they always did. But so would Horus. And as long as the pharaoh stood, the gods would not abandon Egypt. The earth trembled beneath their feet. Dust rose into the air, choking the light and casting shadows over the battlefield. Men stood shoulder to shoulder, their hands clutching weapons that felt heavier with each passing breath. Their faces were streaked with sweat and dirt, but it was not the weight of the battle that made their hearts race. It was something unseen, something ancient. The whispers of God stirred in the wind, carried like a warning through the ranks. The sky above darkened as if the heavens themselves were watching, waiting. Thunder rumbled in the distance, low and steady, like the growl of a predator. The soldiers did not speak, but their eyes betrayed their thoughts. They felt it. This war was not just theirs. It was older than the stones beneath their feet, older than the rivers that carved through the land. The gods were watching, and their fury would not be quiet. On one side, banners of gold rippled in the wind, their symbols carved with the falcon's eye, the mark of Horus. On the other, blackened standards bore the twisted emblem of Set, jagged and sharp like a serpent's fang. The armies of men reflected the eternal struggle of the gods, and their hatred mirrored that of the divine. A horn sounded, piercing through the air like a scream. The lion surged forward, and the ground quaked under the weight of thousands of pounding feet. Shields locked, and swords clashed, sending sparks into the dim light. Cries of rage and agony broke the stillness as men fell, their bodies trampled beneath the chaos. Blood soaked into the earth, feeding it, staining it. In the heart of the fray, a warrior raised his spear, his armor glinting despite the gloom. He fought as though possessed, his strike swift and deadly. His enemies fell before him, and yet his eyes were wild, driven not by fear or honor, but by something far deeper. The gods had touched him. They had whispered in his dreams, filled his veins with fire, and shaped his fury into a weapon. He felt their presence as surely as he felt his pulse. Across the battlefield, another man rose. His blade was dark, etched with symbols that seemed to writhe as the light hit them. He moved with precision, his strikes cutting through armor as though it were paper. But there was something hollow in his gaze, something empty. He fought not for victory, but for chaos. The god who claimed him demanded destruction, and he answered without question. Lightning split the sky. It struck so close that the earth cracked beneath the soldiers' feet, and for a moment, both armies froze. Eyes turned upward, searching the heavens, but there was no comfort there, only fury. The storm raged, and the wind howled as though the gods themselves were screaming. The battle resumed with renewed violence. The warrior of Horus raised his spear and roared, driving his men forward. They answered with cries of their own, their fear buried beneath rage. The lines crashed together once more, and the earth groaned beneath them. Blades flashed, and shields shattered. Men fell, their cries cut short as the weight of the battle consumed them. Yet neither side yielded. It was not just pride that kept them fighting. It was faith. They believed the gods were watching, judging. To fall was not just to die, it was to fail the divine. The warrior of Set met his foe at the center of the chaos. Their weapons clashed, sending sparks into the air. The ground seemed to shift beneath them as though even the earth feared their fight. Their strikes were swift, each one heavier than the last, fueled by something that burned hotter than mortal anger. The storm above raged, and the winds tore through the battlefield, carrying ash and cries into the void. Yet neither man faltered. They fought as though they were no longer men but extensions of the gods themselves. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the storm broke. The winds died, and the air grew heavy, suffocating. The soldiers faltered, their steps slowing as the weight of exhaustion and fear pressed down upon them. But the two warriors did not stop. Their blades rang out like thunder, and their voices rose above the silence. One struck, and the other countered. Blood splattered across the sand, but they kept fighting. Their bodies were broken, but their spirits refused to yield. At last, one fell. His weapon slipped from his hand, and his knees hit the earth. He gasped for breath, but there was none to be found. The other stood above him, his blade trembling as he raised it for the final blow. But he hesitated. The storm had passed, and the gods were silent. The earth no longer trembled. The battle was theirs now, only theirs. For the first time, he felt the weight of his own choices, the weight of his own mortality. The blade fell, and the earth drank again. The victor stood, his chest heaving, his eyes turned to the horizon. He did not raise his weapon in triumph. He simply stared, as though searching for the gods who had abandoned them. The battlefield grew quiet, but the scars remained. The blood soaked into the earth, and the cries of the fallen echoed through the wind. And as the sun began to rise, it cast its light upon the broken banners and shattered shields, a reminder that the war of gods had left its mark on the hearts of men. The river ran red under the setting sun. Silence stretched across the land, broken only by the soft cries of those who mourned. The air was heavy, thick with the weight of grief. Osiris, the king, the god, lay lifeless, his body broken, his spirit scattered. The earth seemed to hold its breath, unwilling to believe that death had claimed one so divine. Yet there he was, wrapped in linen, pale as the moon, his eyes closed forever. Or so it seemed. The whispers began that night. They moved through the shadows, soft as the wind, but sharp as a blade. "He is gone," they said. Set has won. Fear spread like fire, devouring hope. For without Osiris, there was no balance. Without him, chaos would rise, unchallenged and endless. But Isis refused to let despair take root. Her tears fell like rain, but her hands did not tremble. She moved with purpose, her footsteps steady as she searched the land for the scattered pieces of Osiris. One by one, she found them, hidden in rivers, buried beneath sand, locked away in caves. With each fragment she reclaimed, the weight on her heart grew heavier, but she did not stop. Love drove her forward. Love and something more, something fierce and unyielding. Night after night, she worked. Her voice carried through the darkness as she spoke ancient words, weaving spells older than time. The stars seemed to tremble, drawn to her power. She called upon the heavens, the earth, and the waters. She called upon life itself. And slowly, the pieces began to come together. Flesh rejoined flesh, bone found bone. Still, Osiris lay silent. The gods watched from above. They saw her devotion, her sacrifice, and they listened. Anubis, the keeper of the dead, came forward. His jackal eyes burned in the shadows as he knelt beside her. His hands, steady and sure, anointed Osiris with sacred oils. He whispered prayers that bound the body to the soul, weaving light into what had been lost. But it was not enough. The body lived, but the spirit remained distant, caught between the worlds of the living and the dead. Isis's voice cracked as she pleaded with the heavens. Her cries pierced the veil between life and death, and in that moment, something stirred. A breath. Soft but certain. Osiris opened his eyes. The earth shuddered. The rivers stilled. Even the stars seemed to pause, their light frozen in the sky. Osiris rose, his form bathed in light, and the shadows recoiled. The gods bowed, but the mortals trembled. For Osiris had returned, but not as he was before. He had crossed the threshold, seen the darkness, and come back bearing its secrets. Death had touched him, but it had not consumed him. He stood now as a bridge between worlds, a ruler not of the living, but of the dead. The halls of the afterlife awaited him. Vast and endless, they stretched beyond mortal sight, guarded by serpents and beasts, filled with trials and dangers. But Osiris did not fear them. He walked through the gates with the strength of one who had faced oblivion and emerged whole. In the land of shadows, he built his throne. He sat among the reeds of Aru, where the river flowed with silver and the fields stretched green and endless. The souls of the departed gathered before him, their hearts heavy with judgment. He held the scales, and Anubis stood at his side, guiding the lost and weighing their deeds. The hearts of men trembled as the feather of Maat, the truth, floated above the scales. Those who carried darkness sank beneath the weight of their sins, devoured by the beast Ammit. But those who had lived with honor stepped into the light, their spirits reborn in the fields of eternity. Word of Osiris's rebirth spread like fire. The people lifted their eyes to the heavens, no longer bound by fear. Death was no longer the end. It was a passage, a path that led to Osiris's embrace. The afterlife was no longer a void. It was a kingdom, and its gates were guarded by the god who had conquered death. But the living did not forget the cost. They remembered Set's betrayal, his hunger for power, and the blood he spilled to claim it. They remembered Isis's tears, her strength, and her defiance. They remembered Osiris's silence, the stillness of his body, and the breath that brought him back. And they vowed never to forget. The priests carved his story into stone, etched his name into walls, and built temples that stretched toward the skies. They spoke his name in prayers, in songs, and in whispers. And as they buried their dead, they wrapped them in linen, placed amulets upon their chests, and spoke the same words Isis had spoken. They believed. They believed in the scales, in the fields of eternity, and in the judgment of Osiris. They believed that life did not end with the last breath, but began anew beyond the veil. And so they lived, not with fear, but with purpose. The winds carried their prayers to the god who ruled beneath the earth. They lit fires in his honor and left offerings at his feet. And Osiris watched, his eyes steady and eternal, as the cycle of life and death unfolded before him. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the land grew quiet once more. But somewhere in the shadows, a voice lingered, a voice that had crossed the threshold and returned. And it whispered to those who listened that even in the darkness, there was light. The battle had ended, but the air was still thick with the taste of blood and dust. The clash between Horus and Set had shaken the earth, echoing across every kingdom, every heart. The gods themselves had watched in silence, their eyes like burning coals from the heavens above. On the field, Set's body lay broken, the serpent god's twisted form crumpled in defeat. And Horus stood victorious, though he had paid a price no mortal or divine being should ever have to bear. The great falcon, once a symbol of hope and strength, had now claimed his rightful place. But it was not the crown that he sought, nor the throne that waited for him. No, it was something deeper. The land of Egypt, battered and scarred by war, had called for a savior. And it was Horus who answered. The god who had once been a child, who had seen his father Osiris torn from him, now stood as the symbol of restoration, the heir who would mend a broken world. As he walked forward, the air seemed to hum with anticipation. The people watched from every corner of the land, their faces filled with hope, with longing. They had seen their gods fight. They had seen their kings fall, their lands ravaged, and their homes shattered. Now, they saw Horus, a warrior not just of might but of purpose. The falcon's eyes were steady, fixed upon the future. He did not simply seek power, he sought balance, order, and peace for his people. The coronation was unlike any other. The golden throne, symbolizing divine rule, gleamed under the sun, but it wasn't the gold that captured the attention of the people. It was Horus's eyes, piercing and filled with the weight of destiny. He had shed his blood for this moment. His heart was scarred, but it beat with a rhythm of justice, of strength, and above all, of love for his people. They knew this was not the ascension of a king, but the rise of something far greater. The embodiment of the divine will itself. A hush fell over the crowd as the high priests stepped forward, their robes swaying in the gentle breeze. They were the keepers of tradition, the bearers of wisdom, and their words carried the weight of centuries. With trembling hands, they lifted the crown, the symbol of Horus's victory, above his head. As it descended upon him, the people held their breath. The golden crown touched the god's brow, and with that simple gesture, the heavens themselves seemed to stir. It was more than a coronation. It was the moment when the gods and men were united in a single breath, a single purpose. The heavens watched with approval, for the rightful ruler had returned. The divine kingship of Egypt had been restored. The balance of power between gods and mortals was no longer in question. Horus was not just a king, he was the living embodiment of order, of justice, of the very forces that held the world together. As the golden crown settled, the earth itself seemed to sigh with relief. For so long, chaos had reigned, threatening to tear the fabric of the universe apart. The gods had fought their battles, and men had borne the brunt of their conflicts. But now, the light of Horus shone like a beacon, casting away the darkness, restoring the order that had once been so clear. The people began to chant, their voices rising in a wave of unity. Horus, the victorious. Horus, the just. Horus, the ruler of Egypt. Each word was a prayer, a plea, a song of hope. And Horus, the falcon-headed god, stood tall, his gaze unwavering. He felt the weight of their expectations, the gravity of his responsibility. He was no longer just a god of vengeance or war. He had become the protector of Egypt, the defender of her people, the one who would guide them into a future where peace was more than a dream. The priests raised their arms to the sky, calling upon the gods to bless this new era. The stars themselves seemed to shine brighter, their light reflecting the divine approval that filled the air. But even in the midst of the ceremony, Horus's heart was heavy. He had triumphed over Set, but the battle had taken its toll. He could feel his father's absence like a wound that refused to heal. Osiris had been the heart of Egypt, the god who gave life to the land, the god who had ruled with wisdom and grace. His death had left a scar that no victory could fully erase. Yet, Horus knew this was not the end. It was the beginning. The first step toward restoring the harmony that had once existed between the gods and the people of Egypt. He had taken his place on the throne, but he did not sit alone. His father's spirit, his mother's strength, and the love of all those who had fought alongside him now filled him with purpose. As he turned to face the people, his heart swelled with the weight of his divine mission. They had suffered, they had fallen, and now they would rise again. The rivers would flow, the fields would bloom, and Egypt would stand strong. He was their king, their god, but he was also their protector, their shepherd. The ceremony continued, but the crowd had fallen silent once more, captivated by the presence of their god. Horus spoke, his voice steady, calm, yet filled with the power of the heavens. "This is not just my victory," he said, his eyes sweeping over the people. "This is the victory of Egypt. The victory of order over chaos. The victory of life over death. Together, we will rebuild this land. Together, we will restore the balance." As he spoke those words, the people felt it, something deep within their souls, something ancient and powerful. They were not just witnesses to the coronation of a king. They were part of something far greater, something eternal. They were part of Horus's victory, part of Egypt's restoration. And in that moment, their faith in their divine king was absolute. For Horus's coronation was not merely the passing of a crown, it was the dawn of a new era. One where the gods watched over Egypt, where balance was restored, and where the people could once again look to the future with hope, with purpose, and with faith in the divine protection that had returned to them. The sky above Egypt grew dark, clouds swirling like smoke around the mountains. The air was thick with tension, and the earth beneath trembled, as though it could feel the weight of Set's fury. He had been cast out, exiled to the wilderness beyond the reach of the gods, a place where the sun's warmth rarely touched. But even there, in the cold and desolation, Set's heart burned with rage. There was no mistaking his power. No one had ever doubted that Set was one of the most powerful of the gods, his strength unmatched and his will unyielding. But his very nature was dangerous, unpredictable. His desire for chaos, for destruction, ran as deep as the Nile's waters. He could never be content with peace, for peace was the enemy of what he craved most, control. Set was the god who stood against the harmony of the world, and that made him both a necessary force and a curse. The gods had given him his place in the heavens, yet they had never trusted him. They had never fully embraced him, for they knew what he could become if his anger was allowed to burn unchecked. Set was the storm, the fire, the snake slithering through the garden of the gods. And though they had cast him out, they knew they could never truly rid themselves of his presence. He was always there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Horus had won his battle. The land of Egypt had celebrated, their king crowned, the divine order restored. But even as Horus claimed victory, Set's curse lingered. The wind howled across the desert, carrying the whispers of the exile. Set's anger had not been quelled. His bitterness had not been soothed. He was a necessary force in the balance of the gods, but that did not make him any less dangerous. Set's exile did not mean he would fade into nothingness. No, it only made him more dangerous, like a wild beast backed into a corner. He would not simply wait quietly in the shadows. He would continue to stir up chaos in whatever way he could. Though the gods had stripped him of his throne, they could never erase the fire that burned within him. That fire would always find a way to spread. The people of Egypt knew the stories. They knew of Set's thirst for power, of the destruction he had caused in the past. They knew that though he had been cast out, his influence was never far behind. The crops may have bloomed, the rivers may have flowed, but in the hearts of the people, there was always a shadow of fear. Was Set really gone? Could they ever truly be free of his wrath? The whispers of his name sent chills down the spines of the people, as though his presence were a constant threat that hovered just beyond the edge of their vision. Set's exile had not been a peaceful departure. It had been a war, a battle of wills between gods who knew that peace could not exist without his destructive presence. The world needed Set's chaos to keep it in balance, but at the same time, it feared him. Without Set's chaos, the world would grow complacent. It would stagnate. But Set's chaos could also tear apart everything they held dear. And so, the gods had done what they could to contain him. But even in exile, Set's chaos spread like wildfire. It wasn't just in the physical world that his influence was felt, but in the hearts of the people. Their lives had been shaped by the gods, but Set's absence only left room for his influence to take root in the darker corners of their souls. His power did not just come from his actions, it came from the fear he inspired. It came from the possibility that one day, his rage would return, and the world would once again be plunged into chaos. Set's exile was a curse, not just to him, but to everyone. The gods had thought they had rid themselves of him, but they could never truly escape his influence. Set's presence haunted the lands, casting a shadow over everything. The very nature of the world, with its constant cycle of birth and death, creation and destruction, was shaped by Set's chaos. He was the god of storms, of violence, of the dark forces that could tear apart everything in an instant. And though the gods had cast him out, they had created something even more dangerous in the process, the uncertainty of what would come next. The people of Egypt lived in constant tension, caught between the divine will of the gods and the chaos that Set represented. They had seen what had happened when Horus had risen to power, how the land had been torn apart by war, how the gods had battled amongst themselves for control. They had felt the weight of Set's fury even in his exile, as though the world itself were holding its breath, waiting for the storm to return. Set's exile may have been meant to contain his power, but it had only made him more dangerous. His absence was a constant reminder of how fragile the balance of the world was, how easily the gods themselves could be torn apart. The gods had fought for control, for peace, for order, but Set's chaos could never truly be tamed. It was a force of nature, a reminder that even in the most peaceful of times, there was always a shadow waiting to rise again. As the years passed, the curse of Set lingered in the hearts of the people. It was not just his power they feared, it was the unknown, the uncertainty of what might come next. The gods had their battles, their alliances, their struggles for power, but Set was the one who lived outside of that. He was the wild card, the unpredictable force that could never be fully controlled. And in the hearts of the people, his exile only served to remind them that the storm was never truly gone. It was always there, waiting. Every night, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the world seemed to hold its breath. Darkness crept across the land, but it was more than just the absence of light. It was the return of Apophis, the ancient serpent, coiling through the void, determined to swallow the sun. The fear of the night was real, tangible, a cosmic struggle between light and darkness, between life and death. The battle was not just a fight for survival, it was a clash that echoed through the very fabric of existence, a cosmic war between Ra, the sun god, and Apophis, the embodiment of chaos. Each day, Ra would rise, the golden chariot of the sun climbing across the sky, bringing warmth and life to the world. But every night, as the sun sank into the shadows, a new terror arose. Apophis, the monster of darkness, lay in wait, ready to strike. His presence was a reminder that no matter how bright the day, night would always come, bringing with it the possibility of defeat. Ra knew this. He understood the stakes of his eternal journey. As the sun god, he was not just a symbol of light and warmth, he was the force that held the universe together. Without him, the world would fall into chaos. But it wasn't just Apophis that Ra had to battle. He fought against the very nature of darkness, against the endless cycle of night that threatened to consume everything he stood for. Every day, Ra embarked on his journey across the sky, the chariot pulled by his loyal followers, his heart burning with the determination to bring light to the world. But as the night drew near, the battle would begin again. Apophis would rise from the darkness, his massive coils undulating through the void, a threat to everything Ra held dear. The struggle between Ra and Apophis was not just a physical battle, it was a battle of wills. Ra's light was pure, unyielding, but Apophis' darkness was relentless, a force that never gave up, never relented. The two were locked in an eternal struggle, a cycle that would never end. As long as the world turned, as long as the sun rose and set, the battle would continue. But what was this cosmic struggle truly about? It wasn't just about the sun and the serpent. It was about the balance of the universe, about the need for both light and darkness to exist in harmony. Without light, there would be no shadows, and without darkness, there would be no need for light. The battle between Ra and Apophis symbolized this eternal balance, a reminder that life was not just about victory, but about the constant struggle to maintain harmony in a world that was always shifting between light and darkness. As the sun began its descent each evening, Ra's chariot slowed, and his warriors braced for the battle. The serpent would rise, a shadow against the glowing chariot, a promise of darkness. Ra's heart burned with the knowledge that this was not a battle he could ever truly win, not completely. Every night, he faced Apophis, but even in his victories, the serpent would rise again. And every day, Ra would rise once more, pushing back against the chaos that sought to undo the order he had created. It was a cycle of inevitable conflict, a dance between the forces of light and dark, where one could never exist without the other. As the darkness crept closer, Ra's followers gathered around him, calling out his name, urging him to fight, to keep the night at bay. They knew that without him, their world would fall into nothingness. But Ra understood something they could not yet see. This battle was not just about him winning, it was about the journey, about the constant push and pull between the forces of order and chaos. Ra did not fear the darkness. He knew that it was part of the world, a force as old as time itself. But in his heart, he also knew that the battle against Apophis was not just for the sun, but for the world itself. If the serpent succeeded, if the night swallowed the sun completely, everything would be lost. The very existence of life, of the earth, of the heavens, depended on Ra's ability to rise each day, to fight the darkness back. As Apophis slithered through the void, the tension in the air was palpable. It was a battle that would determine the fate of all things. But in the midst of it, Ra's warriors fought with everything they had. They knew that the stakes were higher than just the daily rise and fall of the sun. They fought for the light, for the warmth, for the very essence of life itself. And then, in the darkness of the night, as Apophis coiled closer, Ra would make his final stand. His chariot, pulled by the celestial steeds, would shine brighter than ever, a beacon of hope in the vast, empty space. It was here, in these moments, that the true nature of the battle was revealed. It wasn't just about defeating Apophis. It was about the eternal cycle of creation and destruction, of light and dark, of life and death. Ra's victory over Apophis wasn't always guaranteed, and every battle felt like a desperate last stand against the inevitable. But each time the sun rose again, each time the light broke through the darkness, it was a testament to the resilience of the forces of order, of the strength of Ra's will. The people watched in awe, knowing that the sun's return meant that they had survived another night, that they had been given another day to live, to breathe, to love. As the day stretched on and the light bathed the world, there was a sense of peace, a sense of unity between the forces of light and dark. They were not enemies, they were partners in the eternal cycle. And though Apophis would rise again, the light of Ra would always return, a promise that the darkness could never consume the world completely. The sun would set. The darkness would come. And the battle would begin once more. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the land. A storm was brewing in the heavens, a reflection of the storm within. Two figures stood opposite each other, locked in an eternal struggle. One, tall and proud, the other, dark and twisted, both carrying the weight of their destinies on their shoulders. Horus, the falcon-headed god, a symbol of life, order, and light, faced Set, the chaos bringer, the embodiment of evil and disorder. Their clash was not just a battle of gods, it was the struggle of the universe itself, a fight for the very soul of Egypt. As the winds howled between them, the tension in the air was thick, palpable. It wasn't just power they fought for. It wasn't even the control of the land or the throne of Egypt. It was the balance of the world itself. Horus and Set were two sides of the same coin, two forces that defined the very nature of existence. Without Horus, there could be no order, no stability. Without Set, there would be no challenge, no change. One could not exist without the other. Set's eyes gleamed with the fire of destruction. He was not merely evil, he was a necessary force, the chaos that kept the world from stagnating, the wild winds that blew through the trees, the storm that shook the earth to its core. He was the shadow, the thorn in the side of perfection. Where Horus brought life and light, Set brought death and darkness, not out of cruelty, but out of a deeper need. He was the force that disrupted complacency, the storm that cleared the air. But Horus, standing tall with the weight of the world on his shoulders, was a protector, a healer. He was the warrior who fought to preserve the peace, the life, the order of all things. His wings spread wide, his heart burning with the need to defend, to uphold what was just. Where Set was the fire that could destroy, Horus was the flame that could heal. They were opposites, yes, but they were also intertwined in ways that could not be ignored. Without one, the other could not exist. The battle between them was more than a physical fight. It was a battle of principles. Set struck with the fury of 1,000 storms, his blows like thunder crashing through the earth. Horus, with the grace of the falcon, countered every strike, his movements a dance of precision and purpose. The land trembled beneath their feet, the skies darkened and brightened in a wild pattern, reflecting the chaotic energy between them. But even in the heat of battle, there was a strange respect between them. They were not enemies in the traditional sense. They were two halves of a whole, each fulfilling a role that was necessary to the world's existence. Set's chaos could not be destroyed, for it was the spark that ignited the fire of creation. And Horus, though the embodiment of order, could not destroy Set, for without that chaos, there would be nothing to protect, no battle to fight. The gods of Egypt understood this deep truth, even if mortals could not. They were aware that the victory of one would not mean the defeat of the other, for balance could not be achieved through destruction. In the end, Horus and Set fought not because they hated each other, but because their roles demanded it. Without Horus' victory, the world would fall into darkness, into stagnation. Without Set's, the world would grow complacent, weak. Each blow struck by Horus carried the weight of hope, the hope that order would win, that peace would return, that the land would once again see the sun rise after the long, hard night. But Set fought with the fury of a beast driven by his own inner fire, a fire that could burn away everything, that could swallow the light whole and leave the world in ruins. And yet, even in his rage, Set was not entirely evil. He was the force that reminded the world that nothing lasts forever, that change is inevitable, and that there is power in destruction as much as there is in creation. As their battle raged on, it became clear that neither would win without the other's cooperation. The land had been torn apart by their blows, the sky darkened by their wrath. The people of Egypt, who had once worshipped both gods in their own right, felt the effects of their conflict. Crops withered, rivers overflowed, and the winds blew harsh and cold. But the gods understood something that mortals did not. In order for life to thrive, there had to be both order and chaos. There had to be both light and dark, both life and death. In their final moments, as the sun began to set, Horus and Set stood before each other, their chests heaving, their bodies battered but not broken. There was no victory, no defeat, only the knowledge that they were tied together, forever linked in the cosmic dance that defined existence. The storm raged around them, but it began to subside. The winds died down, the skies cleared, and a faint light broke through the clouds. Horus, with his falcon eyes, stared at Set with a look that was both weary and understanding. Set, in turn, gazed back at the god of order, a flicker of something almost like respect in his eyes. The battle was over, for now. Neither could exist without the other. The world would continue to spin, the sun would rise again, and the storm would come once more. In the end, it wasn't about who won or who lost. It was about the balance that each brought to the world. Horus and Set were both needed, for they were the eternal forces that shaped the world, the guardians of the delicate equilibrium between creation and destruction, light and dark. Without one, the world would be nothing. With both, the world would continue to turn, the seasons would change, and life would continue to thrive. The sun sank beneath the horizon, casting a soft golden glow across the land. The air was still, heavy with the weight of 1,000 unspoken words, 1,000 unresolved struggles. The warriors, their bodies worn and bloodied, stood on the battlefield, eyes filled with confusion. The dust, once thick with the fury of battle, had settled, leaving only silence in its wake. This was not the silence of peace, but the silence before a reckoning that would come not through the sword or spear, but through something far more powerful, Ma'at. It was a concept that few truly understood, yet all were bound by it. Ma'at was not just a word, it was the heartbeat of the world, the force that held everything together. It was truth, it was justice, and it was the unwavering law of the universe. It was the light that guided through the darkest of nights, the force that balanced the scales of life. The Egyptians knew it well. Without Ma'at, the world would fall into chaos, just as a ship without a rudder would be tossed helplessly upon the waves. In the wake of battle, as the dust settled and the last cries of the fallen faded into the earth, Ma'at appeared. She was not seen as a woman in the traditional sense, but rather as an essence, a presence that radiated from the heart of the gods themselves. She was the voice of reason in the storm, the calm after the battle. Her feather of truth lay heavy in the hands of those who sought it, guiding their decisions with an authority that could not be questioned. The soldiers, once fierce and filled with anger, now felt the weight of their actions pressing down upon them. Their weapons felt foreign, their victory hollow, their losses unbearable. The cries of the wounded echoed in their minds, and in the silence, Ma'at spoke. She did not speak with words, but with a presence that filled the very air. It was not mercy she offered, but truth, a truth that demanded justice, that called for reconciliation. There was no room for vengeance in her gaze. She was not here to take sides, to declare one warrior right and another wrong. Mayat was a force beyond human comprehension, and she demanded that all who sought her guidance face the truth of their actions. The generals, who once commanded with fire in their eyes, now stood humbled before her. The scales of justice were being weighed, and no amount of bloodshed could tip them in favor of the unjust. One man, his hands shaking as he held his sword, looked out at the carnage. His brother lay lifeless on the ground, a victim of the very war they had fought to win. The blood that stained his armor was not just that of his enemies, but his own kin. In that moment, he felt the crushing weight of his own choices. His eyes turned toward the horizon, where the last rays of the sun flickered as if dying, as if the world itself mourned. Mayat did not need to speak to him directly, for he felt her presence like a breath on his neck, urging him to see the truth, to see the war not as a series of victories and defeats, but as a cycle of pain that would never end unless broken. He knelt beside his fallen brother, his heart heavy with regret, and for the first time, he felt the stirrings of something new, responsibility. He had fought for a cause, but in the end, it was Mayat that showed him the true price of that cause. In another part of the battlefield, a general who had won countless wars now stood with bloodied hands, his mind racing. He had gained the title, the land, the glory, but at what cost? The faces of the fallen haunted him. He could no longer ignore the truth. No victory was worth the lives of so many. His power had come at the expense of justice, and Mayat was the force that would not let him escape it. Her feather, light as air yet heavy with truth, pressed upon his heart. He saw before him not a field of conquest, but a field of broken dreams. The cries of the fallen reached his ears like a distant song, a haunting melody that would never fade. And as Mayat whispered her truth, his vision cleared. His quest for power, his endless pursuit of more, had blinded him to the destruction he had wrought. In that moment, he knew that true victory was not in the sword or the throne, but in the restoration of balance. Mayat did not demand punishment, for punishment was not her way. She demanded accountability. She demanded that the heart of the world, broken by conflict, be healed through understanding, through the courage to face what had been done and seek a new path. It was not an easy path to walk, but it was the only path that could restore harmony to a world so often torn apart by the very forces it had created. The warriors, once hardened by battle, now stood before Mayat, their hearts laid bare. The weight of truth pressed upon them, and the path to redemption was clear. They could no longer see the world in terms of winners and losers. There was no glory in war, only loss. But in the truth of Mayat, they saw a glimmer of hope. There was still a way forward, still a chance for peace. As the night began to fall, the warriors lowered their weapons. Their hands, once raised in violence, now sought a different kind of strength, the strength to face the truth. The battle had ended, but the war within was just beginning. And in that moment, Mayat was there, a silent but unwavering guide, showing them the way. The winds began to settle, and the earth seemed to breathe once more. The sky, once darkened by the storm of conflict, began to clear. In the distance, the stars began to twinkle, as if the very heavens were taking a breath of relief. It was not the end of the war, but it was the beginning of something more profound. The true resolution had been found, not in the clash of swords, but in the peace that followed. And so, under the watchful gaze of Mayat, the world began to yield. The warriors, their hearts heavy with understanding, knew that the path forward would not be easy. But they had learned the most important lesson of all, that truth and justice were not just ideals to be fought for, they were the very forces that could mend the world, one broken heart at a time. The thunder rumbled across the sky as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows over the Nile. The waters churned, swollen with rage, as though the river itself were preparing for war. Beneath its surface, in the depths where few dared to go, a figure stirred. The mighty Sobek, god of the Nile, crocodile-headed and fierce, was on the move. His territory was being threatened, his sacred waters under attack. And when Sobek moved, the earth trembled. For centuries, the Nile had been his domain, the lifeblood of Egypt flowing through his veins. It was a river of life, a river of death, a river that knew no master but him. The creatures of the river, fish, crocodiles, reeds, had flourished under his watchful eyes. But there were those who sought to challenge him, to steal what was his, to push him aside. These invaders would learn the hard way. No one dared defy Sobek and live. The warriors who had come from far away, unaware of the ancient forces they were challenging, had no chance to prepare for the terror that lay below the surface. It wasn't just a god they were up against. It was the river itself. The sound of crashing waves filled the air, and the warriors, who had once felt brave and certain in their mission, now felt the first stirrings of fear. The water was alive. It wasn't just water. It was power. It was anger. It was the wrath of Sobek. They had thought to take the river for themselves, to control its flow and bend it to their will. But what they didn't understand was that the Nile was not just a body of water, it was the lifeblood of Egypt. And Sobek would never allow anyone to pollute that sacred flow. His eyes, glowing with an unnatural fire, scanned the horizon. He could feel the invasion like a venomous snake winding its way toward his heart. But Sobek was no mere god of vengeance. He was the protector, the guardian of the river, the one who ensured that the sacred waters flowed clean, untouched, free. And so he rose from the depths, his mighty form rising above the water like an unstoppable force. His body, covered in scales that gleamed like polished armor, glistened in the fading light. His jaws, wide and filled with teeth that could tear through stone, snapped with fury. The earth itself seemed to shake beneath his fury. His roar, a sound like thunder crashing through the heavens, reverberated across the land, sending birds fleeing from the trees and creatures diving into the depths in terror. The invaders, now feeling the full weight of his wrath, began to realize the mistake they had made. They had heard the stories, of course. But stories were just that, stories. They had not known the truth of Sobek's power. Now, as his massive form surged from the river, they could only stare in awe and terror. His crocodile eyes, gleaming like emeralds, locked onto their leader. There would be no mercy. There could be no mercy. The battle was not fought with weapons alone. Sobek's war was a war of water, a war of life and death. The river was his ally, and with a single motion, he sent a tidal wave crashing into the invaders. The warriors, caught off guard, were swallowed by the raging water. They were swept away like leaves in a storm, powerless against the god of the Nile. Sobek was relentless. His jaw snapped, his tail lashed, and the river itself rose to meet his fury. There was no escape from the waters. The river was both savior and destroyer, both gentle and merciless. But Sobek's rage was not born of mere anger. It was born of love. Love for his sacred waters, for the life they sustained. His heart beat with the pulse of the Nile, and any threat to its purity was a threat to the very soul of Egypt. The invaders had not known this. They had not understood the depth of the connection between the river and the god who protected it. They saw only water, not the life that it gave, not the creatures that thrived within it. And so they were blinded by their greed, by their thirst for power. As the battle raged on, Sobek's power seemed to grow. The sky darkened, and the river's surface twisted and churned like a storm about to break. The invaders were scattered, drowning in the wake of their arrogance. The air was thick with the scent of the river, the taste of salt and blood. The warriors, now struggling to stay afloat, could only look to the god, their minds filled with horror. They had never believed in the full force of Sobek's power until now. And by then, it was too late. But Sobek did not revel in the destruction. His fury, though mighty, was not endless. As the last of the invaders fell beneath the waves, he fell still. His eyes, burning with the fierce light of the Nile, softened for a moment. The river stilled, its surface smoothing like glass. And in the silence, Sobek's heart spoke. He had done what was necessary, what was right, but the war had come at a cost. For even in victory, the god of the Nile could feel the weight of the battle. The river had been stained by blood, and the land would bear the scars of this war for years to come. The waters calmed, but Sobek's task was never truly over. The Nile would continue to flow, and the threats to its purity would always remain. He could never rest for long, not while there were those who sought to destroy what he loved. But for now, the river was safe, and Sobek's victory had been assured. As the sun set, casting its final golden light across the land, the god of the Nile sank beneath the waters once more, his body vanishing into the depths. The river, now calm, would carry on its endless journey, a journey that would forever be guided by Sobek's watchful eyes. And so, the Battle of Sobek was won, but the war would continue. For as long as the Nile flowed, so too would the fight to protect its waters. And in the heart of the river, beneath the surface, Sobek would always be there, waiting, watching, guarding the sacred flow. In the dim light of ancient Egypt, when the world was still raw and untamed, there was a name spoken with both reverence and awe, Neith. She was a goddess of war and wisdom, a deity whose presence in the mythological wars often faded into the background, yet her victory over chaos was a triumph that still echoed through the ages. It was a time of great unrest, a time when the very fabric of reality seemed to be on the edge of unraveling. Forces of disorder, of madness and destruction, were rising like a storm. The world trembled, as though holding its breath, waiting for someone to stand against the ever-encroaching darkness. From the shadows, Neith emerged, fierce and steady, a force unlike any other. But the world had forgotten her, and even the gods were unsure of her true strength. They could not have known that Neith had already seen the worst of chaos and knew the price that must be paid to restore balance. The chaos had been swift, a surge of chaos incarnate. Nothing was safe. The earth cracked and the skies turned dark, a cloak of terror wrapping the world. With each passing moment, disorder crept closer, threatening to swallow everything. The gods watched from their celestial thrones, each uncertain of the power needed to defeat it. Yet in the heart of the storm, Neith was calm, standing resolute with a bow of strength and arrows of unyielding will. For Neith was no ordinary goddess. She was not just a warrior, but a master strategist, a figure who understood the delicate balance of the world. She had seen the birth of the sun, watched the rivers of Egypt rise and fall. She had witnessed the chaos of creation and understood that to combat it, she would have to bring more than just power. She would need wisdom, patience, and, above all, precision. As the chaos threatened to tear the world apart, Neith did not rush headlong into battle. She did not act out of haste or anger, but with a quiet strength that was all her own. With each step, she moved as if the world itself bent to her will. Her arrows, sharp and true, did not fly randomly. Each one was aimed with the precision of a mind that saw beyond the present moment, each shot a calculated strike against the forces of disorder. The battle was not won with the might of brute force alone, but with the understanding that chaos could not be destroyed. It had to be guided, controlled, and shaped. Neith's victory was not simply about defeating an enemy. It was about bringing order to the chaos, about showing that even in the darkest moments, there could be light. Her arrows flew like streaks of silver in the night, striking at the heart of the disorder, piercing through the lies and falsehoods that had crept into the world. The gods watched in silence as Neith took her place in the battle. Some of them had doubted her, dismissed her as a mere force of nature, a goddess whose strength was in her solitude and wisdom. But in this moment, they could see what had always been true. Neith was not just a goddess of war, but a goddess of purpose. She knew that every action, every decision, had consequences. She did not fight for the thrill of battle, but for the future of the world. And in that, she found her true strength. As the battle raged on, Neith's presence became undeniable. The chaos, once wild and uncontainable, began to wane under her watchful eye. Where there had been madness, there was now calm. The skies, once shrouded in darkness, began to clear. The earth, once cracked and broken, began to heal. Neith's victory was not just a triumph of strength, but a victory of the mind, of understanding the true nature of the forces at play. She had not simply fought chaos, she had redefined it, bending it to her will. When the storm finally broke, when the last remnants of chaos were driven back into the shadows, the world stood in awe. The gods, who had watched in disbelief as Neith had worked her magic, now stood before her in silent admiration. They knew that they had witnessed something incredible, a victory not just over chaos, but over the very nature of disorder itself. Yet Neith's victory would not be celebrated with great fanfare or loud cheers. She was not a goddess who sought praise or recognition. Her triumph was quiet, personal, and known only to those who truly understood the battle she had fought. For Neith, the victory was not in the moment of conquest, but in the knowledge that balance had been restored, that the world could continue its endless cycle of birth and death, of creation and destruction, in harmony once more. And so, in the quiet aftermath of the battle, Neith disappeared back into the shadows from which she had come. The world would go on, as it always had, but now, it would be different. The forces of chaos were not gone, they would always exist, lurking in the corners of the world, ready to rise again. But they had been tamed, controlled, shaped by the wisdom and strength of a goddess who had understood that true power was not in destruction, but in balance. Though her victory over chaos may have been forgotten by many, it was never truly lost. In the hearts of those who understood the delicate balance of the world, Neith's triumph remained. A victory not of swords and shields, but of the mind, of patience, and of the quiet strength that guided the world back to its rightful place. And as the years passed, her name became a whisper, a legend passed down in stories. Some remembered her as the goddess of war, others as a figure of wisdom. But all who spoke her name understood one thing: Neith had conquered not just chaos, but the very essence of what it meant to be a god. She had stood against the storm and emerged victorious, not through force, but through the wisdom of knowing when to fight and when to let the world heal on its own. The river was still. Not a single ripple disturbed its glassy surface as the moon hung heavy in the sky, its pale light bathing the sands in a ghostly glow. The air was thick, carrying whispers of ancient wounds and unfinished battles. Two figures stood at the edge of the water, their shadows long and stretched across the earth like scars that refused to fade. Horus, the falcon-eyed god, stood tall with shoulders that carried the weight of generations. His gaze was sharp, piercing the night as though he could cut through the darkness itself. Across from him, Set loomed like a storm, his presence raw and unyielding. His eyes burned with fire, but behind the flames, there was something else, something fragile, something that looked almost like regret. The silence between them was louder than thunder. It spoke of endless wars, of rivers turned red, and of hearts hardened by hatred. They had fought not just with weapons, but with their very souls, tearing each other apart in a battle that felt like it would never end. Yet now, in this stillness, the world seemed to hold its breath as if daring to hope. Horus's voice broke the silence first. It wasn't sharp, not like the blade he had once raised against Set. It was low and steady, but there was an edge to it, a trembling edge, like a rope stretched too tight. Why did it have to come to this? Set flinched, barely visible, but Horus caught it. For all the years he had seen Set as nothing but an enemy, a beast hungry for power, this moment betrayed something he had not expected. Fear. Not fear of losing, but fear of being seen, of having the mask ripped away. Set stepped closer, his footsteps heavy in the sand. Because we are not the same. His voice rumbled like distant thunder. You were born to rule, and I was born to break. That's what they always said, isn't it? Horus didn't answer, but the words lingered. Set had always been the storm, the chaos that threatened to shatter everything Horus fought to protect. But in this moment, Horus saw him not as a monster, but as something more. A force that didn't exist to destroy, but to test, to challenge, to keep the world alive by forcing it to grow stronger. Still, the wounds ran too deep, and the past refused to let go. Set's betrayal, the death of Osiris, the endless bloodshed, they all hung between them like chains, heavy and cold. Horus clenched his fists, and for a moment, the anger came flooding back. Do you think this can be undone? Horus's voice rose, sharp and bitter. Do you think the dead can rise, that the scars will vanish just because we stand here pretending to make peace? Set's eyes burned brighter, but he did not lash out. No, he said softly. But I'm tired, Horus. And so are you. It was the truth, and it cut deeper than any weapon ever could. The fight had taken everything from them, years, blood, and pieces of themselves that could never be recovered. Yet in that exhaustion, there was something else. The faintest flicker of understanding. Set knelt down and ran his fingers through the sand, letting it slip through his hands. "I never wanted this," he whispered. "I never wanted to be the villain. But I had no choice. It's what I was made to be." Horus stepped closer, the sharpness in his eyes fading just enough to let the moonlight soften his features. "And now?" Set looked up, his expression raw and unguarded. "Now, I want to stop fighting." The words hung in the air, fragile and uncertain. Horus felt the weight of them, the risk of trusting them, but something inside him shifted. Perhaps it was the years of war, or perhaps it was the realization that without Set, without the chaos, there could be no balance. Light could not shine without shadow, and order could not exist without something to challenge it. Slowly, Horus extended his hand. It trembled slightly, but he kept it steady. For a heartbeat, Set hesitated, as if unsure whether to reach back or let the moment slip away. Then, he took Horus's hand, his grip strong but not crushing, steady but not forceful. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. The wounds were still there, and the memories would not fade overnight. But it was a start. It was an unspoken promise to fight differently, not against each other, but for something greater. The river stirred, a gentle ripple spreading outward as though the world itself had exhaled. The stars seemed brighter, the night less heavy. And in that moment, Horus and Set stood not as enemies, but as two sides of the same truth, order and chaos, light and shadow, bound together in a fragile, unbreakable balance. Neither spoke again. There was nothing more to say. But as they turned away from the river, walking side by side, the earth felt less fractured. It was still scarred, but the scars were no longer wounds. They were reminders of pain, of survival, and of the chance to heal. And though the sands would shift, and the storms would rise again, there was something stronger beneath it all. A bond forged not through love, but through the kind of understanding that only comes from seeing the worst in each other, and choosing to stand anyway. The sky wept softly as the earth lay still beneath it. Clouds stretched thin, their edges trembling like the breath of a lover hesitant to speak. The ground, dark and unyielding, waited in silence, its surface scarred by the weight of time. For centuries, the heavens and the earth had been apart, divided by forces they could neither control nor defy. Yet, there was a longing that refused to die. Nut, the goddess of the sky, arched overhead, her body adorned with stars that flickered like distant prayers. Her arms stretched endlessly, cradling the horizon, but never touching the world below. She was vast, beautiful, and untouchable. Beneath her, Geb, the god of the earth, lay firm and steady, his form covered with rivers and valleys. He was strong but restless, yearning for what he could not reach. They had been separated by command, torn apart by Ra, the sun god, whose judgment had carved a barrier between them. It was said that their closeness had threatened the order of creation itself, their union so powerful it defied balance. And so, they were forced apart, Nut suspended above, her body stretched wide, and Geb pinned below, his arms reaching upward but never grasping. The nights were the hardest. When the sun dipped below the horizon and shadows spilled across the land, Nut would weep. Her tears fell as rain, soaking the earth, and Geb would drink them in, desperate to feel her presence. He would send green shoots and flowers upward, reaching for her, but they never touched. The distance between them was endless, and yet they never stopped longing. But the gods cannot silence love, no matter how tightly they bind it. The ache in Nut's heart grew heavier with each passing day, and Geb's sorrow turned to rage, cracking the earth and sending tremors through the land. The skies groaned under the weight of their sorrow, and storms raged, shaking the heavens. It was Shu, the god of air, who held them apart. He stood between them, his arms pushing Nut upward and holding Geb down. But even Shu began to falter. The cries of the earth and the tears of the sky wore him thin. He saw the suffering and knew it could not last. One night, when the stars burned brighter than they ever had, Nut whispered. Her voice fell like a breeze over the earth. I cannot bear this anymore. Geb heard her, and his voice rumbled up from the ground. Neither can I." Their words carried through the air, and Shu, who had always obeyed the will of Ra, finally hesitated. He lowered his arms ever so slightly, just enough for Nut to bend toward the earth. Her fingertips brushed the tops of the tallest trees, and the earth trembled with joy. It was forbidden, but it was unstoppable. Nut and Geb touched, if only for a moment, and the world was forever changed. From their union, life was born. Osiris, Isis, Seth, and Nephthys emerged, their existence a testament to love that could not be contained. But their defiance had consequences. Ra, the great sun god, saw what had been done and cast his judgment once more. He commanded that Nut should give birth in secret, hidden from the light of the sun, and that her children would bear the weight of the god's wrath. Nut bowed her head, accepting the punishment, but Geb rose in defiance. "Take my body," he said. "Break it, flood it, burn it. But I will not regret this." Ra did not answer, but his silence was heavy. The days that followed were harsh, the rivers overflowed, the ground split, and fire rained from the sky. But Nut and Geb endured. Their children were born, and the world grew richer for their presence. It was said that Nut would stretch herself even further to protect her children, hiding them in her body until they were ready to walk the earth. And Geb, scarred and broken, would cradle them with the strength of a father who knew what it meant to lose everything. Even now, the sky and the earth remain apart, their love a quiet ache that hums through the world. When the rain falls, it is Nut's tears reaching for Geb. When the earth trembles, it is Geb crying out for her. And when the stars shine, it is their promise that no matter how far apart they are, their bond will never break. The gods may have tried to keep them apart, but love, true love, cannot be caged. It spills through cracks and rises from ashes. It bends, but does not shatter. And though Nut and Geb remain divided, they are never truly separate. For every blade of grass, every drop of rain, and every glimmering star carries their story, a story of longing, defiance, and a love that even the gods could not destroy. The sun trembled on the edge of the horizon, its golden light bleeding into the waters of the Nile. But even as it rose, shadows clung stubbornly to the edges of the world, darker and heavier than they should have been. The air was thick, carrying a weight that made the birds fall silent and the reeds along the riverbanks shiver without wind. Beneath the sky, hidden in the unseen depths of the underworld, a serpent stirred. Its scales were black as tar, slick with shadows that moved like living things. Its eyes, glowing like embers, burned with hatred ancient and endless. Apophis, the great devourer of light, uncoiled itself. Its hunger was vast, and its purpose was clear, to drown the world in chaos. The gods felt it before they saw it. The ripples of its presence slithered through the air, twisting the natural order. Flowers closed their petals, the river's flow faltered, and the stars seemed to dim. Ra, the sun god, stood at the helm of his solar bark, preparing to cross the skies, but he knew the path would not be clear. Apophis waited in the shadows, ready to strike. But this time, Ra was not alone. The gods gathered, summoned by whispers carried on the wind and by visions carved into their dreams. Isis, the goddess of magic, stepped forward first, her eyes sharp and unyielding. Her words became spells, and her spells became walls, weaving barriers of power to shield the sun's path. Her hands trembled only once as she traced symbols into the air, but she did not falter. Set, god of storms and deserts, arrived next. His spear glinted, its tip jagged like lightning. He had faced Apophis before, had felt the serpent's coils tighten around him, but still, he stood. His voice roared through the silence, challenging the darkness. "You will not pass," he bellowed, and the earth seemed to echo his cry. Thoth, the keeper of wisdom, joined them, carrying scrolls filled with words sharp enough to cut through shadow. He whispered incantations older than time, words so precise that even the winds paused to listen. Beside him, Batet, with her feline grace, bared her claws and let out a hiss that sent shivers through the shadows. She was the silent predator, the unseen protector, and her eyes glowed with fire. Neith, the weaver of fate, stood at the edge of the gathering. Her hands held a bow carved from the bones of long-forgotten beasts, and her arrows shone with light stolen from the stars. She pulled the string back, her gaze steady, as if she had already seen how this battle would end. And still, Apophis came. The river churned, its waters rising as the serpent's massive form slithered through the depths. Its mouth opened, revealing fangs that dripped with venom. Darkness spread like poison, twisting the light and warping the air. Ra's bark shook as the serpent's coils lashed out, but Set was there, leaping from the deck with his spear in hand. He struck, and lightning flashed as metal met scale. The serpent writhed, but Set held firm, driving the beast back even as its tail whipped and sent him crashing against the hull. Blood stained his armor, but he rose again. Isis raised her hands, and the spells she wove turned the shadows to smoke. They swirled and clawed at her, but her voice rose above their cries. "You have no power here," she shouted, her words searing through the darkness like fire. Batet leaped into the fray, her claws tearing at the serpent's flesh, each strike faster than the last. Thoth's voice echoed through the chaos, his spells striking like arrows, pinning the beast's movements. Neitha's bow sang as her arrows found their mark, piercing through scales that no mortal weapon could harm. But Apophis was endless, its body writhing and regenerating faster than the gods could strike. It opened its jaws, and for a moment, it seemed the light would fail. Ra stepped forward. His staff burned like the sun itself, and he drove it down with all the force of creation. Light exploded outward, blinding and pure, pushing the serpent back. But Apophis hissed and lunged again, its hunger undeterred. It was Set who struck the final blow, driving his spear through the serpent's eye. Apophis let out a scream that shook the heavens, and the gods pressed forward, their power combining as one. Light, magic, and fury collided, and the serpent's form began to crumble. Still, it did not die. It could not die. Instead, it sank back into the shadows, retreating into the depths of the underworld to nurse its wounds. The gods knew it would rise again, as it always did, but for that day, for that moment, they had won. The sun rose higher, burning away the last traces of darkness. The Nile flowed again, calm and steady, and the stars above flickered as though they were sighing in relief. Ra looked at the gods who had stood beside him, their faces weary but resolute. They had fought together, not as rivals, but as protectors of balance. The battle had scarred them, but it had also bound them. The world had been saved, if only for another day. But the gods knew the battle would never truly end. Apophis would return, and so would they. For as long as the sun rose and fell, they would stand together, guardians of order against the chaos that lurked in the dark. Stone walls whispered stories in shadows and light. The air inside the ancient temple felt heavy, thick with the weight of countless prayers and offerings. Faint carvings stretched across the walls, each groove and mark chiseled with purpose, as though the stones themselves had witnessed battles long before time wore their edges smooth. Torches flickered, casting dancing flames that made the warriors on the wall seem alive, their swords gleaming and their chariots thundering through clouds of dust. A pharaoh stood frozen in the stone, his body rigid with power, one arm stretched high, gripping a mace ready to fall. His enemies knelt beneath him, arms raised in surrender or pleading for mercy. The scene was fierce, yet something about it felt eternal, as though the figures carved there refused to let their stories be forgotten. The temple walls did not lie. They held wounds and triumphs, pain and glory. Each line carved into the stone carried a heartbeat, a rhythm that pulsed with the cries of battle and the clash of bronze. Soldiers marched in endless rows, their spears pointed to the sky, while chariots surged forward, wheels spinning like storms. Horses reared, their nostrils flaring as arrows rained down. Gods watched from above, towering over men. Horus stretched his wings, his sharp eyes piercing the chaos below. Set snarled in the shadows, his form half animal, half monster, ready to tear through enemies without mercy. Isis stood still, her hands raised, casting spells that shielded the righteous and confused the wicked. The heavens and earth seemed locked in an eternal struggle, and yet the carvings whispered victory, a victory that demanded blood and sacrifice. In the tombs, the walls told different stories, quieter but no less powerful. A warrior lay at rest, his body adorned with amulets meant to guard his soul in the afterlife. Around him, painted hieroglyphs showed his deeds in vivid colors, scarlet for blood spilled, gold for triumph, and deep blue for divine favor. His chariot was there, the horses frozen mid-gallop as if they might burst forward at any moment, carrying him across the fields of reeds where the gods awaited. The figures on the walls were more than art. They were prayers etched in stone, desperate cries for protection, for remembrance. The soldiers stood tall even in death, their bodies strong, their weapons sharp, their faces calm as though fear had never touched them. They fought not only for themselves, but for eternity, their stories meant to echo long after their bones had turned to dust. The walls did not shy away from pain. Some carvings showed fallen warriors, their shields cracked, their bodies twisted in the dirt. Mothers wept beside them, their arms reaching out, while priests stood over the dead, pouring offerings to guide their souls. These scenes bled raw emotion, grief mingled with pride, loss tangled with honor. In one corner of a temple, a lone figure stood out. A woman, her arms raised, her face carved with determination. She held a torch, its flame licking the air, and behind her, soldiers rose again, pushing forward against the darkness. Her presence spoke of hope, of resilience that could not be extinguished. The gods might shape fate, but the people still fought for it. The hieroglyphs carried stories in their curves and symbols. A falcon soaring over a serpent told of Horus defeating Set, reclaiming order from chaos. A lotus flower blooming from muddy waters promised rebirth after destruction. And the endless rows of shields and spears carved in precise patterns hummed with the promise that the people of Egypt would stand united, no matter how fierce the storm. Some carvings bore the scars of time. Cracks split through faces, limbs faded into shadows, and yet the images refused to disappear. The battles remained etched in stone, refusing to yield to the erosion of years. It was as if the gods themselves had guarded these walls, preserving the stories as reminders that every victory came at a cost. In the flickering light, the carvings seemed to shift. A chariot wheel spun. A spear struck its target. A god's eyes burned with judgment. The air grew heavy again, filled with whispers too faint to hear but impossible to ignore. The walls were alive, pulsing with stories that had no end. Each symbol carved into the stone felt deliberate, as if the artist's hands had been guided by forces unseen. The lines flowed like rivers, bending and twisting to form shapes that captured movement, breath, and life. Even the smallest details, the curve of a horse's neck, the flare of a soldier's nostrils, held meaning. Nothing was forgotten, not even the fear in the eyes of the fallen. Outside the temple, the wind howled through the ruins, stirring sand and dust. But inside, the walls stood unbroken, their stories untouched. The gods still watched, their faces etched into stone, their eyes fixed on the battles that defined the world. The hieroglyphs did more than preserve history, they demanded to be felt. The cries of warriors, the thunder of hooves, the clash of swords, all of it lived within the carvings. The walls did not whisper, they roared. They called out to anyone who dared to listen, refusing to let their voices fade. The gods had seen the battles, and so had the artists who carved them. They had stood in the shadows of the temples, chisels in hand, capturing every moment as if the stone itself might forget. Their hands had bled, their backs had ached, but they kept carving, knowing that these stories could not be lost. In the flickering light, the carvings cast long shadows, stretching across the walls like ghosts. The figures seemed ready to step out of the stone, to fight again, to remind the world that the battle between order and chaos would never end. And even as the light faded, the carvings remained, unyielding and eternal. The drums began before the sun touched the horizon. Low, steady beats echoed through the temple courtyard, each thud sinking into the earth like footsteps of unseen giants. The crowd gathered, their faces streaked with ash and ochre, their eyes reflecting the flames of torches held high. Priests moved among them, their robes trailing like shadows, their voices chanting words older than memory. A warrior stepped forward, his body painted with symbols of power, falcons, serpents, and lotus flowers. In his hands, he carried a blade, its edge glinting under the firelight. He raised it toward the sky, and the chanting grew louder. Women wailed, their cries piercing the air, calling upon the gods to look down and remember. This was no mere performance. It was an offering, a reenactment of battles fought by beings greater than men. Every step the warrior took mirrored Horus's march against Set, every swing of his blade echoed the strike that avenged Osiris. Blood spilled, not in death, but in sacrifice, painting the earth in patterns that told stories of struggle and triumph. Smoke curled from incense burners, twisting into shapes that seemed alive, snakes writhing, wings spreading, eyes watching. The scent was sweet yet heavy, pressing against the skin and sinking into the lungs. It was as if the gods themselves had entered the space, unseen but undeniable. The priests lifted their arms, their voices trembling as they called out the names of the gods. Ra's name rang first, sharp and commanding. Then came Isis, her name softer but no less powerful. Set's name followed, spat like a curse, only to be silenced by the cries for Horus to rise and strike him down again. Men and women fell to their knees, pounding the earth with their fists. Tears streaked their faces as they cried out for protection, for strength, for the balance that Ma'at promised, but chaos always threatened to destroy. The tension thickened, like the air before a storm. A torchbearer stepped forward, carrying a flame so bright it seemed to hold the sun itself. The crowd parted, their whispers fading to silence as he approached the altar. At its center stood a statue of Sekhmet, her lioness eyes burning even in stone. Flowers and offerings lay at her feet, jewels, bread, jars of honey, but it was the flame that mattered. The torchbearer knelt and touched the flame to the incense, and a great cloud of smoke rose. It curled upward, carried by unseen hands, as the priests cried out again. They told the story of Sekhmet's wrath, of how her thirst for blood nearly drowned the world until Ra tricked her with red-dyed beer. The crowd gasped as the story unfolded, their fear and awe rising with the smoke. Children clung to their mothers, their wide eyes fixed on the priests. They understood, even at their young age, that these rituals were not just for show. They were shields against the darkness, reminders that chaos could only be held back if the gods were honored. The warrior stepped forward once more, his blade now wet. He turned to the crowd, raising his arms high, and shouted words that made the earth seem to tremble. The people answered, their voices raw, their cries blending into one desperate plea for Ma'at to endure. At the edge of the courtyard, musicians joined the drums, their flutes and strings weaving melodies that sounded like weeping. Dancers emerged, their bodies painted like birds and beasts, their movements sharp and wild. They leapt and spun, their feet pounding the earth as if to drive chaos back into the shadows. A woman stood among them, her face streaked with tears. She carried a jar filled with water from the Nile, her steps slow and deliberate as she approached the altar. The priests chanted as she poured the water, and the crowd stilled, holding their breath. This water was sacred, the river's lifeblood, guarded by Sobek and blessed by Happy. Its touch on the earth was a promise that the gods had not abandoned them. The flames roared higher, and the priests lifted their arms again, their voices rising until it seemed the sky itself might crack. The warrior fell to his knees, his blade lowered, and the crowd surged forward to touch the altar, to press their hands against the earth and feel its warmth. Some whispered prayers, others sobbed, but all looked to the statues, to the carvings on the walls, to the torches burning against the night. They believed because they had to. The gods had fought, bled, and sacrificed for them. It was their duty to honor those battles, to keep the stories alive so the darkness could never rise unchecked. The night stretched on, but the fire never dimmed. The drums never stopped. The air remained thick with incense, with voices, with promises spoken in trembling words. The gods listened. They had to. When the dawn finally touched the horizon, the crowd did not leave. They stayed, kneeling before the altar, their shadows stretching long across the stone. The warrior rose, his body trembling but his eyes steady. He had fought, just as Horus had fought, and he had endured. The priests scattered petals over the altar, their hands stained red. The ground bore the marks of their offerings, but the air felt lighter as if something had shifted. The crowd began to sing, their voices soft but unbroken, carrying their prayers to the heavens. The statues watched, their stone faces silent but eternal. The gods did not speak, but their presence lingered, woven into the smoke and the rising sun. The battle was over, but the rituals would never end. They couldn't. The candlelight flickered, casting long shadows on the temple walls. The air was thick with the scent of burning herbs and oils, the smoke curling upward as though carrying whispered prayers to unseen ears. A priest knelt before the altar, his hands trembling as he traced symbols into the sand spread before him. Sweat glistened on his brow, but he did not pause. There was no time for fear. The darkness outside pressed harder against the walls, and he could feel it breathing. He spoke words older than the stone beneath his knees. Words that once thundered in the heavens when Horus clashed with Set. Words that cut through chaos, just as the god's blade had pierced the serpent's heart. Each syllable fell from his lips like drops of blood, feeding the hunger of the spell. His voice grew louder, his chants weaving through the room until they felt alive, buzzing and vibrating as if the gods themselves had entered. In the dim light, the hieroglyphs on the walls seemed to shift. Eyes carved in stone watched him. Falcons spread their wings, and serpents coiled tighter. The priest's hands shook as he reached for the knife, its edge sharp, its handle carved with the image of Anubis guarding the gates of death. He drew the blade through the air, mimicking the strike that Horus had used to wound Set. He saw the battle in his mind, the dust, the cries, the rivers running red, and his heart pounded as though he stood beside the gods. The spell demanded more. He reached for the small clay figure on the altar. It was shaped like a serpent, its mouth open in a silent hiss. He held it high, his voice breaking as he called upon Ra, upon Isis, upon Batet to strike down the evil that threatened to rise. The flames flared, and the shadows danced wildly. Outside the temple, the winds howled. Doors rattled. The sand stirred as if something unseen moved beneath it. The priest did not stop. He pressed his blade against the figure, drawing a line that cracked the clay. The chants surged, filling the room with sound until it felt too small to hold it all. The clay split further, and a sharp crack echoed through the space. The wind stopped. The flame stilled. The shadows froze. The priest fell to the ground, his breath ragged. He clutched the broken figure, whispering thanks to the gods. But he knew the battle was not over. It never was. Chaos always returned, slithering through the cracks, waiting for the moment when fear outweighed faith. The next day, mothers brought their children to the temple. Farmers carried bundles of wheat, fishermen brought baskets of fish. They came with gifts and prayers, their eyes heavy with worry. The priest met each of them, pressing charms into their hands, small amulets carved with the eye of Horus, symbols of protection. He spoke the same words he had chanted the night before, but softer now, gentler. A mother clutched the charm to her chest, her lips moving silently as she prayed. Her son was sick, his skin pale, his breathing shallow. She knelt beside the altar, rocking back and forth, begging the gods to fight for her child the way Horus had fought Set. The priest dipped his fingers into a bowl of oil, tracing the eye of Horus onto the boy's forehead. "Be guarded," he whispered, "by the strength of the gods. Be shielded by the eye that sees all." The mother wept, pressing her face to the floor. The priest stood, his heart heavy. He had seen the battles the gods had faced, etched in walls, painted on tombs, sung in hymns, and he knew their struggles were not so different from the ones these people faced. Death, sickness, hunger, chaos took many forms, and all demanded a fight. That night, he prepared another spell. This time, he carved a figure of Set. Its form twisted, its eyes narrow and sharp. He bound it with red string, knotting it tightly as he chanted words that struck like lightning. The string burned as he tied the final knot, sealing the spell. The temple was silent, but the air was thick, humming with energy. The priest placed the bound figure beneath the altar, hiding it from view. It was not destroyed, but trapped, contained, just as Set had been when Horus claimed his victory. Days passed, and the sick boy grew stronger. His mother returned to the temple, her face glowing with gratitude. She laid a basket of dates and figs before the altar, her hands trembling as she thanked the gods. The priest watched her, his heart swelling with both relief and unease. He had won this battle, but he knew another would come. He turned to the wall, tracing the carvings with his fingers. Horus stood tall, his spear raised. Set writhed beneath him, defeated but never gone. The priest closed his eyes and whispered a prayer, not for victory, but for the strength to keep fighting. Outside, the wind stirred again. The sands shifted. The gods were watching. The torchlight flickered across the marble columns, casting restless shadows that danced like warriors locked in battle. A Roman poet stood before the statue of Mars, his fingers trembling as he traced the carvings on the altar. His thoughts raced with images of blood and fire, of gods wielding weapons against chaos, of echoes that felt older than the city itself. He had heard the tales passed down from Egypt, stories carved in stone and whispered through centuries. Horus and Set. Light and darkness. Order and destruction. He stared at the bronze spear held by the god of war, its tip gleaming in the dim light. It was not so different from the weapon Horus had carried when he clashed with Set beneath a burning sky. The poet's heart pounded as he recalled the legends, how Horus had stood on the edge of the river, his eyes burning like suns, his falcon cry piercing the heavens. He had faced the storm and survived. The poet whispered the names under his breath, names that felt foreign yet familiar, as though they had always lingered just beneath the surface of his mind. The stories traveled, carried by traders and wanderers, by sailors who crossed the Mediterranean and returned with strange symbols etched onto their shields. Soldiers spoke of gods who bled, who raged, who fell and rose again. In the quiet hours of the night, they shared these tales in hushed voices, their eyes darting to the shadows as if afraid the gods might be listening. Greek philosophers listened, too. They wrote of titans clashing in the heavens, of Zeus hurling lightning to overthrow his father, Cronus. The echoes of Horus and Set rang in those words, son against father, order rising from chaos. And beneath those tales, the whispers of Isis lingered, her tears for Osiris echoing in Demeter's grief for Persephone. The gods changed their faces, their names, but their struggles remained the same. In temples of marble and gold, priests reenacted the battles. They poured libations onto the ground, staining the earth like the blood of fallen gods. They sang hymns to Athena, goddess of wisdom and war, but the rhythm of their prayers matched the chants once offered to Neith, the weaver of fate. The threads of one story wove into another, binding them together until they could no longer be pulled apart. In the Roman arenas, the echoes grew louder. Gladiators raised their weapons beneath the roar of the crowd, their battles mimicking the clashes of gods. The sand beneath their feet drank their blood, just as the Nile had turned red when Horus struck down Set. And when the victor raised his arms, the people shouted as though the gods themselves had triumphed. But the echoes did not stop with marble and stone. They reached further, into the stories that shaped knights and dragons, kings and kingdoms. The serpent Apophis, devourer of light, slithered into tales of dragons hoarding gold and fire, beasts slain by heroes who bore swords blessed by the heavens. The struggle of Horus and Set became the clash of Arthur and Mordred, the rise of order from betrayal. The echoes stirred in the words of poets who sang of star-crossed lovers, torn apart like Isis and Osiris, only to find hope in reunion. They whispered through the spells of witches who called upon ancient powers, their voices trembling as they traced the symbols of protection first carved into Egyptian temples. Even now, the stories linger. In theaters, heroes rise to face impossible odds. They wear masks, capes, and armor, but their struggles mirror the gods who fought before them. Horus still spreads his wings over the skies, and Set's shadow still lurks at the edges. The gods no longer walk among us, but their battles remain. A child sits by a fire, her eyes wide as she listens to her grandmother's tale. The story is different now, shaped by time and voices that retold it, but the heart of it is the same. Good and evil. Light and darkness. Chaos and order. She grips the edge of her blanket, her pulse quickening as the hero stands before the monster, blade raised high. And somewhere, carved in stone and hidden beneath the sand, the gods watch. Their battles are not forgotten. Their stories live on, carried by voices that refuse to let them fade. The stone was cold beneath his fingertips. It felt ancient, unyielding, yet alive with whispers that had waited millennia to be heard. The archaeologist brushed away the last grains of sand, revealing symbols carved so deeply they seemed to bleed shadows. His breath caught in his throat. There they were, hieroglyphs that pulsed with stories of gods and war, of blood spilled beneath burning skies, and battles fought at the edge of creation. The chamber smelled of dust and time, but there was something else, a presence lingering in the air, as though the gods themselves still guarded their words. The flicker of torchlight made the carvings seem to move. A falcon spread its wings, and a serpent coiled in defiance. Osiris lay broken, his body torn apart by betrayal, and Horus rose with vengeance in his eyes. The archaeologist's hands trembled as he traced the lines, following the story like a thread through the darkness. The glyphs spoke of chaos rising from the waters, of Set's shadow stretching across the heavens, and Horus standing at the river's edge, his spear raised high. The words seemed to hum, their power undiminished by time. In another corner, the goddess Isis wept, her tears falling like stars. She gathered the pieces of Osiris, her grief turning to determination. The walls bore her image, her arms outstretched, and her voice seemed to echo through the chamber, calling out for justice, for balance, for Ma'at. The carvings shifted as the archaeologist's light moved. The battle unfolded before him, Set's monstrous form towering over Horus, their clash shaking the skies. The hieroglyphs captured every strike, every wound, and every cry. It was not just a story, it was a memory, etched into stone so the world would never forget. Further along the wall, the gods gathered. Ra stood at the center, his staff blazing with the fire of creation, and Neith wove the threads of fate. Thoth held the scales, weighing the hearts of men and gods alike. They did not watch idly, they fought, their weapons carved with prayers and spells, their power reaching beyond the earth to hold back the chaos that threatened to consume it. The archaeologist felt the weight of it all pressing against his chest. He could almost hear the chants, the voices of priests calling upon the gods to rise again. The walls seemed to breathe, the symbols vibrating with unseen energy. There, in the final scene, Horus stood victorious. But his victory was not without cost. Blood stained the ground, and the serpent's coils still lingered, waiting for another chance to strike. The glyphs did not end with triumph. They warned of cycles, battles that would be fought again and again, each victory fragile, each moment of peace held by a thread. The archaeologist stepped back, his torchlight flickering. He had uncovered more than symbols. He had found the echoes of voices that refused to be silenced, the cries of gods who had once walked the earth and faced the shadows that still lingered. The chamber felt smaller now, the weight of history pressing in. He reached out one last time, his fingers brushing the falcon's wings. It felt warm, almost alive. The gods were not gone. Their stories were still here, carved into stone, waiting to rise again. The screen flickered to life, and the theater fell silent. Shadows danced across the walls as ancient gods emerged from the darkness, their eyes burning with power. A warrior, his armor etched with the markings of falcons and serpents, stood on the edge of a vast desert. Sandstorms raged behind him, and a towering figure rose from the horizon, Set, the god of storms and chaos. His voice thundered, shaking the ground, and the audience could feel the weight of the battle about to unfold. The warrior's spear glinted under the scorching sun. He was no ordinary man. He carried the burden of Horus, the legacy of vengeance, justice, and the balance of Ma'at. His footsteps stirred echoes of a time when gods roamed the earth and men fought alongside them. The music swelled, and the desert seemed to breathe as the clash began. The fight felt primal, raw, as if the sands themselves remembered the stories carved into stone thousands of years ago. Blades struck, and flashes of light illuminated the faces of those watching, their hearts pounding in rhythm with the chaos on screen. But this was more than entertainment. It was something older, something that reached into the soul and stirred forgotten memories. Long after the credits rolled, the images lingered. The falcon-headed god, wings outstretched, soaring toward the sun. The serpent, its coils tightening but never breaking the will of the hero. The gods of Egypt had stepped out of the past, their battles reborn in fire and shadows, reaching across time to remind the world of their power. The stories didn't stop with the silver screen. On bookshelves, covers gleamed with golden inks and glowing eyes. Pages turned, carrying readers through labyrinths of tombs where curses slept and whispers echoed. Adventurers faced puzzles and traps designed by gods who refused to be forgotten. In those pages, Horus's falcon gaze guided heroes, and Anubis guarded the gates of the afterlife, judging every step. Gamers held controllers tightly as glowing pyramids appeared before them. Virtual battles raged against towering beasts with crocodile jaws and wings that blotted out the sky. Players wielded weapons blessed by Ra, their strikes leaving trails of light, while the shadows of Set lunged from every corner. Each level felt like stepping through a portal into ancient myths, where every decision carried the weight of survival and every victory echoed like prayers in forgotten temples. It wasn't just the action. It was the symbolism, the stories layered beneath the battles. The gods weren't just characters, they were ideas brought to life. Horus wasn't just a hero, he was hope rising after tragedy. Set wasn't just a villain, he was chaos pushing against order, daring the world to stand firm. And Isis, weaving her magic, reminded everyone that love and loss often walked hand in hand. The influence reached further than people realized. Symbols slipped quietly into logos and designs. Jewelry shaped like the eye of Horus dangled from necks, promising protection. Tattoos of scarabs crawled across skin, guarding secrets and strength. Even in graffiti, artists painted gods with wings spread wide, watching over streets filled with modern battles of their own. The myths whispered in music, too. Lyrics spoke of rising from ashes, of light conquering darkness, of journeys through underworlds to find rebirth. The beats carried echoes of drums that once called warriors to battle in the deserts of Egypt. People danced without knowing their steps mimicked ancient rituals, their movements stirring the same emotions that priests once called upon to honor the gods. The connection was unshakable. Whether on screens, in books, or through the hum of a video game, the myths still breathed. They rose from the sands, wrapped in new forms, but carrying the same stories, the same struggles, the same triumphs, the same warnings. The gods had not been forgotten. They had only changed shape, stepping into worlds where their symbols burned just as brightly. And in the stillness, after the screens dimmed and the books closed, something lingered. A feeling, as if the gods had been watching all along, waiting for their stories to be told again. The stars flickered above the Nile, their reflections trembling in the dark waters as if they feared what lurked beneath. The river, so calm and still, seemed endless, yet its depths whispered secrets older than time. Somewhere in the shadows, a ripple formed, a disturbance so slight that most would not notice. But the priests who stood by the temple steps felt it. They knew what it meant. Chaos was stirring. It had always been there, just out of sight, waiting for the moment when the world looked away. It slithered in the cracks of broken walls and coiled in the spaces where light dared not touch. And yet, against its restless hunger, there was order, unyielding, unbroken. The stories spoke of it. The myths carved into stone told how the gods fought endlessly to keep the balance. Ra's golden barge sailed across the sky by day, but every night, it descended into darkness, where the serpent Apophis waited. With fangs as long as spears and scales like jagged obsidian, Apophis rose to devour the sun, to smother its light forever. But Ra did not face the monster alone. The gods gathered around him, their spears flashing and spells crackling in the air. They fought not for glory but for survival, for the fragile line that separated existence from ruin. The people who knelt before the altars knew these battles were more than stories. They saw the echoes of those struggles in their own lives. The farmer who watched his crops wither under an unexpected drought felt the hand of Set, the god of storms and chaos. The mother who cradled her sick child prayed to Isis, begging her magic to bring healing. And the warrior who stood on the edge of battle carried Horus in his heart, hoping his courage would be enough to silence the fear. The myths did not lie. Life was a war between light and shadow, between hope and despair. It was in the trembling hands of a father trying to provide for his family, and in the tired eyes of a woman fighting to keep her home standing. It was in the tears that fell when loss struck, and in the laughter that rose when love endured. And still, the battle raged. Some nights, it felt as though Apophis had won. Darkness pressed too hard, and the light seemed far away. The priests would stand in their temples, reciting the ancient spells, calling upon Ra to rise again. Their voices carried across the desert, trembling but determined, refusing to let the silence swallow them. Because order did not yield. It fought back with every sunrise, with every seed that broke through the soil, with every child that took its first breath. It fought back when people stood together, when they built walls against the floods and lit fires to push back the night. And yet, chaos was not defeated. It could not be. The myths never promised a final victory. Instead, they spoke of cycles, of endless struggle and renewal. Ra would always face Apophis, and Apophis would always rise again. But so would the sun. That was the truth carved into stone and sung in prayers. Order was not the absence of chaos. It was the will to fight it, to keep standing even when the ground shook. It was the fire that refused to go out, no matter how fierce the storm. The people knew this because they lived it. They saw the floods destroy their fields, and they rebuilt. They mourned their dead and still found ways to celebrate life. They faced the unknown and pressed forward, carrying the weight of fear but refusing to let it crush them. And so, the myths endured. Not because they were ancient, but because they were alive. They bled through time, through generations, reminding everyone who heard them that chaos could never truly win, as long as someone was willing to fight. The Nile flowed on, its waters carrying stories that refused to be forgotten. Somewhere beneath the surface, Apophis still stirred. But above, the stars burned, steady and bright, promising that the sun would rise again.